Hey everybody, I'm going to read a piece now titled Soviet Society and the Problem of Alienation by E.M. Sitnikov and Iring Fetscher. This is an appendix to Iring Fetscher's book Marx and Marxism. German Wikipedia says Iring Fetscher, who lived from 1922 to 2014, was a German political scientist who gained international recognition, particularly through his research on Karl Marx. If you didn't know, Iring Fetscher was the doctoral advisor for Moishe Bastone. His writings include, in 1956, From Marx to Soviet Ideology, that's from 1956. Most recently titled under From Marx to Soviet Ideology, Presentation, Criticism, and Documentation of Soviet, Yugoslavian, and Chinese Marxism. 1960, Rousseau's Political Philosophy on the History of the Democratic Concept of Freedom. 1963, Marxism, Its History and Documents, 1963 to 1965, 3 volumes. 1967, Karl Marx and Marxism. 1972, Who Kissed Sleeping Beauty Awake? The Fairy Tale Confusion, 1972. 1976, Domination and Emancipation on the Philosophy of the Middle Class. 1980, Conditions for the Survival of Humanity on the Dialectic of Progress. 1981, he had a piece in, was he the editor? I'm not sure. Analyses of Terrorism. 1983, Work and Play. 1983, as co-editor, Neoconservatives and the New Right, the Attack Against the Welfare State and Liberal Democracy in the United States, Western Europe, and the Federal Republic. 1985, as co-author, Piper's Handbook of Political Ideas, 5 volumes. 1995, Curiosity and Fear, Trying to Understand My Life. 1999, Tease Me at Chateau Margaux. 1999, Marx. 2002, together with Alfred Schmidt, he edited a volume titled Emancipation as Reconciliation on Adorno's criticism of the, quote, commodity exchange and, quote, society and perspectives on transformation. In 2005, Passion for Collecting and Playful Curiosity, A Cosmopolitan Family. It's in something, like I said, this is from the German Wikipedia, so the translation's not perfect. It says, in Marx Family, Private. I don't know. 2006, Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, Study Edition, Considerations that Led to the Composition of the Text for the Study Edition in 4 volumes. In Contributions to Marx Engels Research. New episodes, Special Volume 5, the Marx Engels editions of works in the USSR and GDR, 1945 to 1968, edited by Karl Erich Vollgraff, Richard Sperl, and Rolf Hecker. Rolf Hecker, if you follow the Critique of Political Economy in Germany, that's a name you see a lot. I don't really know what he's about. 2007, For a Better Society, Studies on Socialism and Social Democracy, and 2018, Marx, an Introduction. So, here we go. That's who Iring Fetscher is. Well, that's his work. Let me actually read the thing about his work. Iring Fetscher found his later main topic, Marx and Marxism, through an article in Les Temps Modernes, in which the French historian of ideas, Henri Arvon, pointed out, as Fetscher reports in his first academic contribution, quote, an inexplicable gap in Marx research, end quote, indicates the clarification of the importance of Max Stirner for the theoretical development of Karl Marx. Although Fetscher did not devote himself to closing this gap, Fetscher became one of the leading Western researchers to Marx's teachings and the doctrines derived therefrom. His best-known writings include From Marx to Soviet Ideology, 1957, and the 3-volume work Marxism, Its History and Documents, 1963 to 1968. In 1985, Fetscher, together with Herfried Münkler, published the 5-volume standard work Piper's Handbook of Political Ideas. In his book Conditions for the Survival of Humanity from 1991, Fetscher reconstructs ecological positions in Marxian and critical theory and addresses the capitalist foundations of environmental destruction. Other focal points of his academic work were studies of Rousseau, Hegel, and Hobbes. Fetscher also achieved a high level of popularity in the Federal Republic through his frequent presence on television, where he commented on topics such as co-determination, Red Army faction terrorism, and the, quote, limits to growth, end quote. Fetscher positioned himself, quote, against conservatism and communism, end quote. He frequently took part in the Frankfurt-Römerberg talks. In the mid-1990s, Fetscher began to publicly deal more intensively with his National Socialist past and published a publication in 1995 titled Curiosity and Fear Are Trying to Understand My Life, a Life Report. It says for his political engagement, Fetscher joined the SPD in 1946, advised Willy Brandt when the latter was a state politician in Berlin, worked alongside Erhard Epler as a member of the SPD Basic Values Commission and advised Chancellors Willy Brandt and Helmut Schmidt. As a member of the commission set up by the social liberal federal government to research the spiritual causes of terrorism, Fetscher visited Horst Mahler, who was in prison, together with social philosopher Günther Rohrmoser. Rohrmoser and Fetscher wrote several books together. All right, so that's that. E.M. Sitnikov. I don't know. I'm not seeing anything for E.M. Sitnikov, so we'll have to just guess. Introduction. In 1962, there appeared in Moscow a publication by a previously little-known Soviet author named Sitnikov, which contained a virulent attack on the work of the Commission on Marxism set up by the Evangelical Study Association, and in particular my own contribution to the Marx Studien, as well as work by the philosopher Fritz Heinemann, who lived in Oxford. Fritz Heinemann was a German philosopher who lived from 1889 to 1970. He taught at Manchester. In Neue Wege der Philosophie, Heinemann heralded published in 1929, Heinemann heralded the rise of the existential movement by coining the term Existenzphilosophie, translated as existentialism. Back to the text. The objection which Sitnikov raises against these authors and their work concerns primarily the use of the category, quote, alienation, end quote, in a sense which Sitnikov considers deviates from that originally intended by Marx. In general, of course, the use of a particular category need only be justified by evidence of the value and benefit to be derived from such use. But things are rather different in the case of the critical category of, quote, alienation, end quote. In his early writings, Marx used the category of alienation or figure of thought, or used this category of alienation or figure of thought as the basis for his most radical criticism of the situation of man in a capitalist society, and thus went far beyond the accusations of the utopian socialists. Marx based his arguments on the assumption that man can live a human life only by objectifying his potential ability in creative work. In this context, Marx defines man as the, quote, objective being, end quote, which can exist only in a world of objects endowed with human form, objects of his being. The, quote, generic characteristic, end quote, of man is therefore his creative activity, which, quote, appropriates, end quote, nature for his own purposes. This is his advantage over animals, and at the same time a danger to him. As soon as division of labor and isolation of ownership of the means of production from actual work develop in the course of historical progress, which according to Marx occurs at an early stage in history, it will no longer be possible for men as individuals to appropriate for themselves the whole range of human objectifications. Men as individuals will be reduced to partial functions and can therefore only partially develop their talents. In the end, they become alienated from all human objectifications which indeed face them, and hostility as representing reified relationships governed by unknown laws which man must obey. This is the concept of, quote, alienation, end quote. Marx was also convinced that alienation would develop to a hitherto unknown extent under the rule of capitalism and finally become so intolerable for the proletarian masses that the proletarian masses would rebel against the system and free themselves and all other members of society from this evil in a wave of, quote, human emancipation, end quote. In my own works, I have always countered these expectations of Marx by pointing to the fact that that phenomena of alienation, at least equivalent to those described by Marx in early capitalist societies, are to be found in contemporary Soviet society. The Soviet form of socialism, therefore, provides no guarantee of eliminating alienation. Sitnikov and other Soviet authors oppose this application of the category of alienation to Soviet society. In the context of this debate, it is of course important to demonstrate that the same phenomena which Marx defined as, quote, alienation, end quote, reification and fetishism of the commodities or related concepts still exist. The following selected comments by Sitnikov seem to me not uninteresting as an example of dogmatic apologia. They will scarcely prove convincing enough that though their selection was unbiased. It is also surprising that the categories used by the young Marx have moved into the areas of study of Soviet Marxism only at such a late stage. In the Western discussion of Marxism, the debate is centered on alienation since the early 1930s, when Marx's fragment, Political Economy and Philosophy, was first published. The reasons for this considerable delay lie on the one hand in Stalinism and its dogmatic association of Marxism-Leninism with, quote, dialectical materialism, end quote, which Stalin made into a form of catechism, and on the other in the extreme critical force of the category of alienation. The early writings of Marx center so strongly on the liberation of man from every form of exploitation, domination, and alienation that a Soviet reader must have understood these comments as a criticism of his own situation under Stalinist domination. For this reason, then, the early writings of Marx were never published in large, cheap editions in Russia. The early writings of Marx were considered to be relatively insignificant works by the young Hegelian Marx who had not yet developed Marxism. More recent works have since, however, convincingly shown that there is a close interrelationship between the early writings with their humanistic orientation and the later main works of Marx, and quite certainly Marx is being done an injustice if his later economic theory is simply interpreted as a model construction of the, quote, pure, end quote, capitalist market economy. Only after the open rejection of Stalin in the spring of 1956 did it become, quote, permissible, end quote, to study the early works of Marx, and since then a number of publications have appeared in which the, quote, humanism of the young Marx, end quote, appears in a more favorable light. Indeed, many attempts are made to present contemporary and above all future Soviet society as the realization of the Marxian idea. The amount of ground which has since been gained by the category of alienation, use of which would seem at times to have been almost punishable, is shown by 4 papers which were read in September 1963 by Soviet delegates to the 13th International Congress of Philosophy in Mexico on the first main theme of the Congress, namely, quote, the problem of man, end quote. In all of them, this category appeared, albeit applied, only to, quote, Western, end quote, societies. The 4 papers were reprinted in a volume. This is a footnote. The 4 papers were reprinted in a volume in English published by the USSR Academy of Sciences, Philosophy, Science, and Man. The Soviet delegation reports for the 13th World Congress of Philosophy, Moscow, 1963. The contributions in question are P.N. Fedoseyev, Humanism in the Modern World, M.B. Mitten, Man as an Object of Philosophical Investigation, F.W. Konstantinov, quote, The Individual and Society, and T.I. Oiserman, Man and His Alienation. End footnote. T.I. Oiserman. Look him up. For some reason, I'm doubting there's going to be anything. I don't know. Theodor Ilyich Oiserman lived from 1914 to 2017 and was a Soviet and Russian philosopher and academician. His biography says, it's short, so I'll read it. Oyserman was born in Petrovirivka into a Jewish family. Oyserman's parents were teachers during World War II. T.I. Oyserman served in the Red Army. T.I. Oyserman was a member of the Russian Academy of Sciences from 1981 until his death. T.I. Oyserman received an honorary doctorate from the University of Jena in 1979 and the USSR State Prize in 1983. In 1979, Oyserman was awarded the Plekhanov Prize for the monograph, The Main Trends in Philosophy. He also served on the Anti-Zionist Committee of the Soviet Public. Following the 1991 breakup of the Soviet Union, Oyserman moved towards social democratic and anti-Leninist positions. T.I. Oyserman viewed Lenin's interpretation and application of the ideas of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in the Russian Revolution as incorrect and believed Lenin's view led towards oligarchy rather than the victorious establishment of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Oyserman died on the 25th of March 2017. Very interesting. Back to the text. T.I. Oyserman, a professor at Moscow State University, even dealt specifically with the subject of, quote, man and man's alienation, end quote. Oyserman's lecture presumably accurately reflected the current standpoint of Soviet philosophy on this problem and therefore deserves presentation, at least briefly. In the first part of Oyserman's lecture, T.I. Oyserman attempted to show that for Hegel and many other contemporary bourgeois thinkers, the theory of alienation was based on a confusion, unacceptable from the Marxist standpoint, between objectification and alienation. Without objectification, man cannot exist. Objectification is not a barrier, but on the contrary an excellent characteristic, which raises man above the world of animals. Alienation, however, only arises out of objectification at the point where the individual cannot appropriate entirely for himself and absorb creatively with all his senses the products which he has shaped, or helped to shape. However, if the concept of alienation is equated with that of objectification, there may either, as in the case of Hegel, only be an abolition of these phenomena by, quote, intellectualization, end quote, or else no possibility of overcoming the fate of alienation if alienation is equal to objectification. T.I. Oyserman is of the opinion that the majority of contemporary, quote, bourgeois, end quote, philosophers in effect abstract from the concrete historical necessity of alienation and speak of the alienating nature of labor under any given set of certain conditions. This abstraction then necessarily leads to a pessimistic attitude towards the possibility of overcoming alienation. Death is seen as the only possible redemption from a necessarily alienated life. In contrast with these concepts, which are sometimes characterized as a, quote, anthropologization of Hegel, end quote, Oyserman outlines the Soviet Marxist view in the second part of Oyserman's lecture. Footnote. Presumably, T.I. Oyserman is here thinking mainly of Kojève's book on Hegel and the work of Jean-Paul Sartre, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, Herbert Marcuse, and perhaps also Erich Fromm. The last two thinkers also feature a conjunction of Marxist and psychoanalytic thought patterns which is strictly rejected in Soviet philosophy. This combination is, however, clearly indispensable for any profound discussion of the problem of alienation. End footnote. Where am I? Okay. End footnote. T.I. Oyserman admits that in socialist and even communist societies there will still be contradictions, difficulties, social tensions, etc., but that these contradictions, difficulties, social tensions, etc., must not be confused with alienation, which simply results from the, quote, antagonistic conflicts associated with private property as well as the existence of antagonistic classes, one of which appropriates the work of the other, end quote. The example which T.I. Oyserman chooses to illustrate his theory is certainly not very convincing. If a man builds a house, T.I. Oyserman states, this activity as such does not involve an alienated action, since, quote, work is the natural and most important manifestation of human vital creative power, end quote. Quote, man does not alienate himself simply because man works, but because man does hard labor which takes up the greater part of his life, because he provides forced labor which prevents him from developing the other sides of his nature, end quote. T.I. Oyserman. T.I. Oyserman, however, detects the reason for this alienation in the, quote, low level of development of the productive forces of society which has led to private ownership of the means of production, to social inequality and exploitation, end quote. T.I. Oyserman. The weakness of this presentation will be immediately apparent to anyone who is acquainted with the early writings of Marx. Marx, in fact, repeatedly pointed out that the aim must not be to distribute work uniformly, but to, quote, abolish, end quote, work, by which Marx certainly did not understand that it should simply be replaced by mere idleness, but by another form of human practice which would have none of the typical characteristics of the industrial society today and the division of labor which the industrial society entails. Above all, work should become to an ever-increasing extent, a conscious, scientific, and voluntary activity, and therefore help to develop human potentialities and pleasure in this development. The reason for the fact that human practice consists primarily of alienating activity, work, are seen by Marx as existing on the one hand in the system of ownership, according to which ownership of the means of production and production itself are vested in two different groups of persons. The productive workers own nothing, while the owners are non-productive, and on the other, in the lifelong involvement of workers in a partial function. In the Soviet Union, the second reason is generally overlooked, or consideration of it postponed until that ultimate state of development, namely, quote, full communism, end quote. In no case, however, may the problem of alienated work be reduced to the question of, quote, heavy labor, end quote, as hinted at in the passage from T.I. Oyserman's lecture, which we have quoted here. Physically strenuous work can in any case be eliminated more and more in every existing social order as a result of technical progress. The critique of the Soviet use of the category of alienation must, however, go further. If, in fact, we accept the accuracy of Marx's theory that all political, ideological, and social alienation results from, quote, alienated work, end quote, and at the same time learn that there is no longer alienated work in the Soviet Union, we shall either have to abandon Marx's premise or question the second assertion. I would opt for this second alternative. Without doubt, the phenomenon of alienation still exists in Soviet society today, in spite of the not inconsiderable standard of living enjoyed at least by the urban population. This holds good in a range of cases similar to those encountered in Western society, where they come in for frequent criticism by Marxists. Work is still primarily considered not as a free development of individual talents, but as a hard necessity. Consumption is always the exclusive center of interest. Indeed, quote, personal material interest, end quote, is even taken into consideration as an important factor in all calculations under the economic plan. The absence of spontaneity and activity is scarcely less criticized by Soviet than Western authors. Material progress, improved cinema, television, library facilities, etc., for the population certainly present no guarantee of cultural development, as has long since been proved. The superiority of Soviet book production, emphasized by academician Fedoseyev, 4 times as many books printed, is no proof, even if we accept it as wholly accurate, of cultural superiority or of a lesser degree of alienation. One second. Footnote. In the lecture quoted from above, Fedoseyev states, quote, socialism, while ensuring an accelerated development of the economy at an unprecedented pace, creates at the same time conditions for the intellectual development of the individual. In its turn, the development of the individual is a powerful factor accelerating socialist progress. The dialectical interdependence of the objective and the subjective is an immutable law of socialism. The dialectical interdependence of the objective and the subjective is an immutable law of socialism. This law determines the continual growth of education and culture in countries of socialism. Thus, to satisfy the mounting intellectual requirements of people in the socialist world, books are published in much greater quantities than in all other countries. The average per capita rate in the world is under 2. As for the Soviet Union, the annual publication is 1,250 million books, i.e. the annual per capita rate is 6 new books, i.e. 3 times more than the world per capita rate. The number of books published in the USSR is 4-fold more than in the US, end quote. Fedoseyev, end footnote. The decisive factor is not that books are printed and sold, but the types of books which are printed and how they are read, as well as the extent of activity on the part of readers. These are certainly factors which cannot be easily quantified. The manner in which the Russian Communist Party seeks to explain the phenomenon we have mentioned is, however, a new and no less serious form of alienation. The new party program and most of the works which have since appeared on this question repeatedly emphasize the need for education to a communist attitude to work. The members of the, quote, brigades of communist labor, quote, which already work under excellent communist conditions, end quote, must no longer be motivated by their, quote, personal material interest, end quote, but by the thought of the well-being of the community. In addition, there must be a reduction of the demands of consumers to, quote, a reasonable level, end quote. In this way, the Soviet leadership avoids the problem of alienation in just the direction which Marx would have criticized most sharply. Here the spontaneous alienation must be made acceptable by intensified education and or eliminated at its roots by improved socioeconomic conditions. The liberation from its limiting reality is achieved, as in the case of the conservative Hegelians, by adaptation of the consciousness to the situation which is presented as acceptable. The Marxist approach, on the other hand, would consist in the party leadership inquiring how it is that in spite of a transformation in the situation of ownership and property, so little has changed in the everyday attitudes of the workers and their consciousness. The question remains whether the effect which Marx foresaw of an at least partial elimination of alienation can accompany that form of socialization of the means of production practiced in the Soviet Union, or indeed socialization in general. The problem of alienation can, however, be posed in a much simpler manner, but in a way that is far more disturbing for Soviet Marxists. In fact, we start from the assumption that political alienation must be less in a socialist society than in a democratic capitalist country. We come to the following dilemma. There is no doubt that since 1936 the Soviet Union has been a, quote, socialist, end quote, country, and yet for years after that date Stalin was able to carry out a policy of terrorization of the population, which Stalin himself assumed corresponded to the reasonable will of the active population and the avant-garde of active workers in the USSR Communist Party, but which, as Khrushchev himself emphasized in 1956, objectively conflicted with the interest and will of the majority of the population. In other words, how could such a manifest phenomenon of political alienation remain uncorrected for years on end as the, quote, superstructure of a socialist society, end quote? Or, to take an example from the Soviet literature itself, how are similar phenomena still possible in Albania and Red China today? Every Soviet politician will admit that at least the foreign policy of these countries conflicts with the true, reasonable will of the populations concerned, i.e. represents an instance of extreme political alienation. A Yugoslavian theoretician who disturbed his Soviet colleague with this question in June 1963 received an unsatisfactory answer, as unsatisfactory an answer as I myself did. However, if the socialist revolution cannot even abolish such evident phenomena of alienation as those which I have mentioned, either the entire Marxist theory of alienation must be abandoned, at least in the entire Marxist theory of alienation's positive aspects, or, and this is the method adopted by the Yugoslavians, the entire Marxist theory of alienation must be, and this is the method adopted by the Yugoslavians, it must be shown that the Soviet form of socialization of ownership of the means of production is inadequate because the Soviet form of socialization of ownership of the means of production establishes a monopolistic power of bureaucrats, which differs in fact little from the power of a small, uncontrollable stratum of pirate owners, even if this bureaucratic power cannot be directly inherited. Directly being the key word there. As we can see, discussion of the problem of alienation leads on to decisive political questions concerning the form of a, quote, socialist society, end quote, and that socialist society's democratic, and socialist societies, that form of a socialist society's democratic content. As I have emphasized in my reply to Sitnikov, I am in no way concerned in my critical works with the defamation of Soviet society and Soviet ideology, but I criticize Soviet society and Soviet ideology because I am convinced that Soviet society and Soviet ideology represent an inadequate social order and a false consciousness of this social order. The automatic process of economic and technical development of Soviet society is not sufficient to bring about that transformation which is discussed so much in the West. It is first necessary for the ideology which masks the reality of this society to be corrected so as to show that what in fact requires alteration. Demonstration of the defects in the Soviet world in no way constitutes a defense of the faults which mar our own. Some of us are, at least I hope so, well aware of these faults and enjoy the liberty among our other freedoms of analyzing, if not correcting them. New section. A Soviet critique of, quote, Western, end quote, interpretations of Marx. Footnote. Extracts from E.M. Sitnikov, The Problem of Alienation in Bourgeois Philosophy and Falsifiers of Marxism, Moscow, 1962. So this is Sitnikov speaking now. What is the ultimate aim of the quote, subtle philosophical, end quote, thought processes of Metzger, Thier, and Fetscher? Let's see. Metzger. Not seeing anything from Metzger. Yeah, I'm not seeing anything for Thier either. So the only person that I know from this is Fetscher, or can find information about. What is the ultimate aim of the, quote, subtle philosophical, end quote, thought processes of Metzger, Thier, and or Fetscher? First of all, the young Marx is presented as an idealist, and if not as a 100% Hegelian, certainly as a thinker on Hegelian lines. Marx, these thinkers assert, continues the philosophy of Hegel in a changed form. Marx retains Hegel's main principle, however, the conviction of the, quote, revolutionary functions of the consciousness, end quote. Quote, Hegel believed in the humanity of man which becomes conscious, end quote. In the case of Marx, writes Fetscher, the wise man who is identified in contemplation with the, quote, spirit of the world, end quote, is replaced by a subject-object which embraces and shapes the whole of human historical reality. The spirit is, therefore, replaced by the spirit's incarnation in the proletariat. According to Marx, quote, the great dialectical reversal was effected by the interpretation of reality which breaks through to thought and of thought which penetrates to reality. In the encounter between philosophy and the proletariat, between self-consciousness which becomes action, and the process, i.e. a socio-economic process which is made conscious, end quote. Fetscher. This is the Hegelianization of Marx. Fetscher also speaks of the Hegelian Marxist concept of reality. i.e., of Marx and Hegel's coincident notions of social reality, which arises from stage to stage until it finally reaches the highest stage of development. Fetscher, Metzger, and Bigot. Footnote. The references here to Pierre Bigot, Marxisme et Humanisme, Introduction à l'ouvert économique de Karl Marx. I'm not seeing anything really for Pierre Bigot. I see a birthday. Seems like he wrote a book called The Church and Third World Revolution. And it says that he lived from 1906 to 1997. So, that's all I have to say on Bigot. So, Fetscher, Metzger, and Bigot are not the first to attribute Hegelianizing tendencies to the young Marx simply by replacing the spirit of the world by historical reality itself, and then replacing the self-awareness of the Hegelian spirit, i.e. that force which the spirit needs to achieve its full possibilities, by the self-awareness of the proletariat. Early in the 1920s, two publications had already come out which falsified Marxism in this way: History and Class Consciousness by Georg Lukács in 1923, and Marxism and Philosophy by Karl Korsch, translated into Russian in 1924. Footnote. Karl Korsch was not just another theoretician, but among other things, as Wolf Dietrich Rasch has shown on the basis of correspondence, the teacher and guide of Bertolt Brecht in his dialectical and Marxist view of history. I did know that Karl Korsch, I think Karl Korsch, Walter Benjamin, and Bertolt Brecht played chess at something in like Brecht's like Norwegian getaway. Let's see who Wolf Dietrich Rasch is. Wolf Dietrich Rasch was a German scholar, literary historian, and translator. His monographs include Friendship with Jean Paul, Friendship Cult and Friendship Poetry in German Literature of the 18th Century, from the End of the Baroque to Klopstock, Herder, His Life and Work in Outline from 1938, Goethe's Torquato Tasso, 1954, about Robert Musil's novel The Man Without Qualities, 1967, on German literature since the turn of the century, collected essays since 1967, Goethe's Iphigenie auf Taurus as a Drama of Autonomy, 1979, The Literary Decadence around 1900, and as translator of Albert Camus' The Myth of Sisyphus in 1950. So, yeah. Characteristically, the evangelical philosophers adopt the philosophical revisionism of Lukács and Korsch. So that's the end of the footnote. And this is back to, what the hell was his name? The Soviet guy. Characteristically, evangelical philosophers adopt the philosophical revisionism of Lukács and Korsch. The revision of the philosophy of Marxism from the position of the Hegelians took on such a plastic form in the case of Lukács and Korsch that Fetscher et al. Simply repeat their thoughts, although they do, of course, add anti-communist slander to this revisionism. Lukács and Korsch are popular among the bourgeois ideologists because Lukács and Korsch translate Marx into the language of Hegelian idealism. The central point is the sanctioning of the identity between consciousness and reality, sanctioning of the revolutionary function of consciousness, the self-awareness of the proletariat. What does such revisionism mean in class political terms? It implies a denial of the need for a proletarian communist party, the leadership of the struggle of the working class by a single party. If the self-awareness of the proletariat is idolized, as Hegel idealized the self-awareness of men in general by imagining the self-awareness of men in the form of the absolute spirit of the world, then the entire historical process is identified with the idealized self-awareness of the proletariat and moves spontaneously forward. A party of the avant-garde of the working class, an organization of the workers, is superfluous. The socialist consciousness of the proletariat is presented as a spontaneous phenomenon within the working class. It is then no longer necessary to introduce the socialist ideology into the workers' movement, as is the aim of the Marxist Party itself. The negation of the party is the reason why the evangelical philosophers have adopted the philosophical revisionism of Lukács, Korsch, and others, and why they so generously bestow their praise on Lukács and his colleagues. I don't know if he's referring to Lukács is I don't know, there was a whole, Budapest school of philosophers that were oriented around Lukács in Hungary. I think István Mészáros was one of the people that were important in that. The political poison which is hidden in such abstract philosophical thought processes is made even more dangerous by attempting to attribute these opinions to Marx. The real aim of those who falsify Marxism is to use the name of the great Marx to inculcate thoughts in the workers which are far removed from Marxism. It is the same when the further development of Marxism is presented as a rejection of the convictions of the young Marx. Fetscher describes it directly as his aim to show how Marxism changed in the course of its development from the theory of the, quote, conscious action of the proletariat into a philosophy which confronted this proletariat in a reified form, end quote. Fetscher. Quote, the penetration of consciousness and action of the proletariat was broken, and the organized proletariat took up position on one side, its, quote, scientific Weltanschauung, end quote, on the other, end quote. Fetscher. Quote, in place of the collective and self-aware proletariat action, there came first the organization of the proletariat within the existing bourgeois social order. The revolutionary function of the consciousness, end quote, was eliminated. In the case of Marx, writes Fetscher, the theory was to add acute consciousness to the existing misery and alienation in order to promote the process of revolution. Theory necessarily transcended into practice collective action. In further course of development, Fetscher asserts, the Marxists ultimately came to view the proletariat as a, quote, passive, end quote, mass which is unable by itself to achieve socialist state consciousness. While Marx, as it were, simply wished to put the spark of consciousness in the form of philosophy among the members of the proletariat, Lenin asserts the need for the existence of a party organization. There follow the usual lying assertions with which we are all too well acquainted already concerning the voluntarism of Lenin, the dictatorship of the Communist Party, and the suggestion that activity in a socialist society emanates exclusively from the party, together with all the other usual anti-communist nonsense. Fetscher and the others present the early Marx as a fatalist, for whom the need for a party which organizes the working class for active conduct does not exist. According to Metzger, Marx denies the need for men to engage in real activity. However, Metzger concedes that in the course of his critical victory over Hegel, Marx's concept acquires one element, of revolutionary dynamics. Stammler's objection that, quote, no party is founded to bring about an eclipse of the moon, end quote, Stammler, therefore simply relates to the vulgar materialistic interpretation of Marxism, states Metzger, and not to the Marxist concept of historical necessity, which is achieved thanks to human activity and specifically binds men to engage in conscious activity. Theoretically, the untenable nature of this argument is conceded, as is the assertion of Sartre that the revolutionary cause becomes a paradox if determinism is total. It is conceded that this is simply a mechanical interpretation of determinism, which has nothing in common with the dialectical standpoint. While, however, the evangelical and Catholic philosophers theoretically isolate themselves from the all too simple and naive arguments of Stammler, they do not in reality deviate from the positions of fatalism which they would like to attribute to the young Marx. Thanks to their class consciousness, the bourgeois ideologists recognize that the Communist Party is the number one danger for them because they know that the proletariat without the Marxist Party is unable to throw off the capitalist yoke. Therefore, the enemies of the workers recognize one or two valuable assets in Marxism, provided that Marxism, as they interpret it, leaves no room for the guiding activity of the party, for the need for a communist party as such. In reality, they are very clearly aware that the proletariat without a Marxist-Leninist party will never become, quote, conscious, end quote, or capable of revolutionary practice, and that the sparks which individual, well-meaning human intellectuals throw among the working masses are doomed to be extinguished harmlessly. Like others who seek to distort Marxism, Fetscher takes one well-known thesis from Marx's introduction to A Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right and attempts to interpret it as we saw in the spirit of Hegelian idealism, but his means of interpretation are inadequate. What does Marx have to say at the point in question? When he deals with the problem of the radical revolution, i.e., not only of the political but also the social revolution, which brings about a radical change in social relationships, he draws attention to the fact that the revolution needs a material basis. The theory, states Marx, is implemented in every nation to the extent that its implementation corresponds to the needs of the people. But he goes on to ask, can the theoretical needs correspond directly to the practical needs of German reality? Quote, it is not sufficient for the thought to work towards its own realization. Reality must itself push towards thought, end quote. Marx. Marx is thinking here merely of the fact that a theory developed on the basis of an analysis of existing facts can be achieved only if certain objective and subjective requirements for implementation of the theory have matured in historical reality. This is the thought which Lenin was later to develop in his doctrine of the revolutionary situation, of the objective and subjective factors of revolution. Marx answers his own question. There is a real possibility of the theoretical revolutionary solution being achieved in Germany. This solution consists in the constitution of a special class, the proletariat. But the existence of the proletariat itself is not sufficient for the revolution to be achieved. The proletariat must first become a force which is subjectively capable of revolution. For this purpose, a combination of philosophy with the proletariat is necessary. It is necessary for the, quote, thunderbolt of thought, end quote, to strike this, quote, ground of the people, end quote. This theory of Marx contains essentially the demand for a combination of the doctrine of scientific socialism, which was at that time still developing, and the proletarian movement. Footnote. From all that we have said, it is apparent that the words of Marx, on which Fetscher and co. seek to base their speculation, have a clear materialist significance, even if it is frequently expressed in metaphysical turns of phrase which externally bear the stamp of Hegel's philosophy. End footnote. In the writings of Marx and Engels, dating from the early period of Marxism, we will of course search in vain for a full doctrine of the Communist Party as it was later to be developed in the Manifesto of the Communist Party and in other works. But if such a full doctrine of the party is lacking in the early writings of Marx and Engels, this does not mean that they set their trust in the, quote, natural movement of historical reality, end quote, in the, quote, self-awareness of the proletariat, end quote, which can supposedly arise without the party. The whole spirit of the early writings of the founders of Marxism and of their practical activity were the preconditions for the development of the doctrine of the party and the formation of the party itself. Fetscher's statement that with the young Marx theory changes directly into practice seems harmless enough, but it has the ultimate result of criticizing Marx and Engels when they campaign against the young Hegelians. According to Fetscher, Marx is supposed to have held the opinion that theory and practice coincide in the action of the proletariat in such a way that it ceases to be necessary to work for the transformation of theory into practice. Discussing the Hegelian origins of the philosophy of Bruno Bauer and others, Marx and Engels wrote as follows, quote, "The speculative mystical identity of being and thought is therefore repeated in criticism as the same mystical identity of practice and theory. This explains their irritation against practice, which sets out to be something more than theory, and against the theory which seeks to be something other than the mere resolution of a specific category into the, quote, boundless generality of self-awareness," end quote. End quote. The Holy Family. Marx. It is only the manifest insolence of the philosophical manipulators of the bourgeoisie which allows them to turn Marx and Engels into advocates of an attitude against which the founders of Marxism turn the full force of their critical powers, and the bourgeois supporters do this in the face of unambiguous statements by Marx and Engels. Marx states that in uprisings such as the Silesian revolt of 1844, the proletariat began to become conscious of the proletariat's essential nature as the class of wage laborers. Nevertheless, Marx and Engels demand study of the practice of the proletarian struggle. Footnote. The attentive reader will, of course, find something other than Sitnikov's interpretation, Sitnikov being the person writing here. The attentive reader will, of course, find something other than Sitnikov's interpretation in the passages from Karl Marx which have just been quoted. There is, in fact, a repeated appeal to brotherly love and a protestation of the humanity of the proletarians against their inhuman position. Here again, the subject under discussion is humanism and humanism's achievement by the social revolution, and not historical materialism and the laws of social development. E.g., quote, "The sole task of a thinking man and lover of truth faced with the first outbreak of the Silesian workers' revolt was not to act the schoolmaster when confronted with these events, but to study their special nature. This calls, however, for a certain scientific insight in love of one's fellows, whereas for the other operation all that is necessary is a ready-made phraseology, ... end quote, Marx." A few pages later, Marx interprets the meaning of this incipient, quote, social revolution, end quote, in contrast to the political revolution as follows. Quote, "A social revolution therefore involves the standpoint of the whole, because even if a social revolution only takes place in a single factory district, the social revolution represents a protest by man against dehumanized life, because it starts out from the position of the individual real person. The individual reacts against his isolation from a community which represents the true communal existence of man, the essence of man. The political soul of the revolution consists, on the contrary, in the tendency of the classes without political influence to end their isolation from the state and government. Their standpoint is that of the state, an abstract whole, which it ... is inconceivable without an organized contrast between the general idea and the individual existence of man," end quote, Marx. Admittedly, this statement is made by the young Marx, but if Sitnikov reads into him the teachings of Soviet Marxism, then revisionists are entitled to other interpretations which do not require so extreme a reinterpretation of Marx. It's a note by Iring Fetscher. And footnote. For what purpose? To give the movement of the working class a reliable compass, the theory of scientific communism. Marx, Engels, Lenin were convinced that the direct practice of the worker struggle can and does produce either a trade unionist consciousness or political attitudes of an anarchistic nature. The enemies of the proletariat, with their sophistic comments on the, quote, self-awareness of the proletariat, end quote, understand by this specifically the consciousness which is opposed to the ideas of scientific communism. They would prefer that the proletariat remain at the level of, quote, self-awareness, end quote, which guarantees the maintenance of capitalism. They would also prefer not to see any connection between the proletarian movement and the science of communism. The science is produced by social practice as well. This science is produced by social practice as well. But this is not the limited practice of an individual worker or factory or country. This social practice is the practice of the struggle of the working class, the entire practice of the historical development of mankind. To be able to generalize this struggle in theoretical terms, it is necessary to have extensive scientific knowledge and to be a specialist in the theory. But the worker who remains a worker is unable, apart from certain gifted conceptions such as Wilhelm Weitling and Dietzken, to study science. Wilhelm Weitling lived from 1808 to 1871, was a German tailor, inventor, radical political activist, and one of the first theorists of communism. Weitling gained fame in Europe as a social theorist before he emigrated to the United States. In addition to Wilhelm Weitling's extensive political writings, Weitling was a successful inventor of attachments for commercial sewing machines, including devices for double stitching and the creation of buttonholes. Joseph Dietzken. Peter Joseph Dietzken was a German, or it's probably Joseph Dietzken. Peter Joseph Dietzken, who lived from 1828 to 1888, was a German socialist philosopher, Marxist, and journalist. Joseph Dietzken was born in Blankenburg in the Rhine province of Prussia. Joseph Dietzken was the first of 5 children of Father Johann Gottfried Anno Dietzken, who lived from 1794 to 1887, and Mother Anna Margareta Luckerath, who lived from 1808 to 1881. Dietzken was, like his father, a tanner by profession, inheriting his uncle's business in Siegburg. Entirely self-educated, Joseph Dietzken developed the notion of dialectical materialism independently from Marx and Engels as an independent philosopher of socialist theory. He had one son, Eugen Dietzken. End footnote, or back to the text. But the worker who remains a worker is unable, apart from certain gifted exceptions such as Weitling and Dietzken, to study science. Only when the proletariat has assimilated the theory of scientific communism developed by Marx and Engels, scientists of real genius, will it really become aware of itself, understand its true nature, and the objectives and methods of its struggle. Without a revolutionary theory, Lenin stated, there can be no revolutionary movement of the proletariat. In contrast with the sophistic assertions of Fetscher, Metzger, and others of their ilk, Marx speaks in the introduction, which I have just quoted, of the 2 aspects of the social movement, of the proletariat as the material force and philosophy as the spiritual weapon. The head of human emancipation is philosophy, and the proletariat its heart, he states. When Marx speaks of philosophy in this context, he quite evidently refers to the development of a scientific revolutionary theory by thinkers based on the position of the proletariat. Naturally, such a great realist as Marx had no doubt that an organization must be established to unite proletarian philosophy with the proletarian movement. The enemies of communism wish to convince their followers that man in socialist society is changed into a mere instrument of society and of the party, into a means to an end, and that only under capitalism, especially in its modern form, genuine human relationships are possible. They are working here on the principle according to which the thief cries out, quote, stop thief, end quote, to confuse his pursuers. The accusations which they raise against socialism apply in fact to their own society based on exploitation. In a capitalist state, economic necessity forces industrialists to rationalize, extend, and make profitable their production lines. The capitalist is simply following his selfish aim to earn profits. To achieve his aim, the capitalist uses men as mere instruments and means. Once he has exerted the maximum possible benefit from them, he is no longer interested in their fate. Recently, the ideologists of capitalism have increasingly publicized the system of, quote, human relations, end quote, in capitalist concerns. The bourgeois philosophers attempt to present this system as the achievement of, quote, humanization of work, end quote, as the abolition of, quote, alienated work, end quote. We simply need to draw attention to one recent example, namely the pamphlet by the evangelical philosopher Iring Fetscher, which was published in West Germany in 1961. As is the custom among bourgeois philosophers, Fetscher sets out to sow doubt about the truth of the Marxist theory that private property constitutes the economic basis for the, quote, alienation of man, end quote. This proponent of capitalist private property objects to the abolition of such property, quote, which does not really change the nature of alienated work, end quote. Various efforts have been made in the capitalist world, quote, to make workers derive an inner satisfaction in their work, end quote. These attempts consist, in Fetscher's theory, in the following procedure. Quote, the workers are given a detailed explanation of the entire production process, regularly moved between the different departments and working functions, given an insight into the operations of the business, and allowed to participate in its management, voting function, and so forth, end quote. Since the bourgeois ideologists attribute very great importance to this problem and offer all kinds of publicity in favor of the measures I have just mentioned, it is worth examining the problem more closely. It is well known that under the conditions of advanced capitalism, and particularly in the stage of imperialism, an upper stratum of workers develops the, quote, aristocracy of labor, end quote, which is supported by the capitalists with the help of their colonial plundering and the profits of their monopolistic corporations. This stratum consists of skilled workers. Recently, as a consequence of automation, there have been such far-reaching changes that the proportion of skilled workers in the older professions and their social importance have tended to decline. The capitalists must now seek to gain the support of the broader strata of workers employed on automated production lines. The method of, quote, stimuli, end quote, developed by Taylorism proved outmoded. The method of stimuli consisted in attributing all too clearly to the worker the function of a passive robot with no will of his own. The inhumanity and impersonal nature of work were all too clear under this method. The system which the capitalists applied to their workers then consisted in exploiting all conceivable capacities of the worker, viewed as a mere mechanism, with the help of the methods of Taylorism. But in order to keep the workers, quote, calm, end quote, and at the grindstone, systems of paternalism, quote, paternal, end quote, care were introduced. The new system of, quote, human relations, end quote, which is now to be applied, contains a variety of methods. Some of these results from the requirements of automated production itself, and others from concessions which were won by the workers of the working class, by the struggle of the working class. The first category includes in particular the initiation of the worker to the production process, which was necessary because workers were needed to carry out the operation required by automated production. The modern worker should understand the essence of the organically linked elements of the entire production line, at least in broad outline. In fact, it is a fact that Marx and Engels already recognized this objective need. The second category of measures includes, for example, the increase in social contributions for the requirements of the working class, construction of dwellings, nurseries, sports facilities, entertainment facilities, and so forth. The capitalists attempt to present all these features as voluntary measures taken by the industrialists who have undergone a, quote, moral transformation, end quote, although the true reason lies, of course, in the class struggle of the workers. There is no doubt that the system of, quote, human relations, end quote, is a tactical device adopted by the bourgeoisie and by the bourgeoisie's advisors who are responsible for the problem of the workers in order to retain their key positions. Human relations and neo-paternalism, as distinct from the early form of paternalism, are designed to, quote, sweeten, end quote, the economic slavery of the workers in capitalist concerns. In the last analysis, all that is involved is a change in the forms and methods of capitalist orientation, while the exploitation itself continues unchanged. The new methods are calculated to arouse the illusion among the workers that they are themselves solving the problems of production and enjoy equal rights. This is the economic background to the question of, quote, human relations, end quote. The aim is to obtain from the worker as an object of capitalist exploitation an additional increase in productivity in the order of 30 or more %. What Taylorism is unable to achieve will, it is hoped, be brought about by the method of human relations. The psychological and political factors are no less important. The General Secretary of the Center for Human Relations in Italy, Signor Moro Visconti, asserts that, quote, it is immaterial to whom a company belongs provided that human relations are good within it, end quote. The General Secretary of the Center, sorry, I'm at the text now. I tried to look up who this person was, this Signor Moro Visconti, but I didn't find anything. This means that in reality, the business remains the property of the capitalists, but the problem loses its importance in the eyes of the workers. We may recall again here the words of Fetscher, according to which the abolition of private property does not alter very greatly the essence of alienated work. This statement reflects the thought which is current among circles of capitalist ideologists and carries a sting in its tail. Capitalist private property is to be pronounced free from guilt. 1 second. The question then takes on the following form. Is it possible, with the help of measures taken within the framework of the system of human relations, and while maintaining private ownership of the means of production, to bring about a, quote, humanization of work, end quote, and consequently to eliminate, quote, alienated work, end quote? Marxists, after analyzing the facts, arrive at the irrefutable conclusion that such a system merely camouflages the alienation of man in a capitalist factory, but in no way eliminates it. Fetscher and others seek to prove the humanization of work with the assertion that the worker is informed of the nature of the production system as a whole, of the marketing position of the company, and so on. But as I have already mentioned, owing to the laws of modern production, the capitalist is becoming increasingly dependent on workers with a broader technical outlook. Does this now eliminate the alienation of the worker from production and the exploitative nature of work in the capitalist factory? Not in the least. The cardinal problem remains that of knowing for whom the worker is working, and this problem is not solved to the advantage of the worker when private ownership of the means of production is retained. The worker toils for the capitalist. The product of his work does not belong to him. This fact has not disappeared and cannot be wiped out by applying the system of, quote, human relations, end quote. It follows that under the conditions of capitalism, the worker cannot experience any general development of his talents. In spite of all the, quote, discussions, end quote, and introduction to the production process, under the capitalist system, the worker's functions remain limited to physical labor. Whatever methods the capitalist may apply, work remains a mere means to obtain a wage and not an expression of the entire wealth of human nature. Consequently, it is not the first necessity of life either. Work for others, forced labor, cannot be an activity from which man derives any pleasure. However much the ideologists of capitalism may try to harmonize the notions of, quote, work, end quote, pleasure, and, quote, interest, the character of the paid work done by the worker does not change. It remains work performed for the capitalist. The worker can have a genuine personality only if the worker ceases to be a proletarian, that is, if the worker is no longer robbed of the ownership of the means of production. In a socialist system, the interests of society become the interest of the working class and all the workers. The members of society cease to be instruments and means to achieve an end. They set themselves historical aims and achieve these aims through their activity. Naturally, the aims of individuals are different from the aims of society as a whole. The individual pursues his personal interests, which need not impinge upon the life of other human beings. Nevertheless, quote, the individual is a social being, end quote, Marx. The formulation and justification of social aims is a task of science which deserves special study. Under the conditions of socialism, social aims are formulated by the social organization and above all by the Communist Party. That's in italics. Under conditions of socialism, social aims are formulated by the social organizations and above all the Communist Party. But even under a perfect state of communism, the general aims are not automatically developed. This process demands skilled men and authorities. It says, my italics, Iring Fetscher. This process demands skilled men and authorities. When a bourgeois thinker defines it as terrible that men decide the fate of others, this is only so because one set of men make the decisions while others merely implement them. But how can we speak of enslavement when human beings decide about themselves and their own interest, even if the formulation of their decision is the task for specialist authorities in the party? It's in italics. But how can we speak of enslavement when human beings decide about themselves and their own interest, even if the formulation of their decisions is the task for specialist authorities in the party? This is possible only in a genuine collective and not in those substitutes for collectivism which have existed and indeed still exist in the antagonistic society. In socialism, the true social and collective force is not alienated from the men who form the society and the collective. Therefore, it cannot be annexed and embodied by an individual group or institution. New section. Hegel, the young Marx in Soviet philosophy. A reply to E.M. Zitnikov. So the last part that I was reading was by E.M. Sitnikov, and now this is returning to Iring Fetscher. So the way this thing, I'm recording this section separately, but so far, just to re-emphasize what's going on here, is that this is like a section, an appendix from Fetscher's Marx and Marxism, and the appendix is a conversation. It had Sitnikov, probably a good chunk of his paper. Maybe it's not the full one. Maybe it is the full one. I'm not sure. And now we're reading Fetscher's response. So, if you made it this far, you're a boss. Thanks for listening. I appreciate it. The method developed by Marx to derive philosophical positions from social conditions has become an easy tool for his Soviet heirs who wish to dismiss critical arguments without even examining them. This is the procedure which Sitnikov repeatedly adopts when he detects a link between Western philosophers and the interest of private capitalism and feels that he has refuted their statements by so doing. Marx himself specifically dismissed this method in Capital as being all too easy and uncritical when he wrote, quote, "It is in fact much simpler to find the earthly kernel of religious mystification by analysis than it is to reverse the process and develop heavenly forms from the real conditions of life on this earth. But the latter is the only materialistic and therefore scientific method," end quote, Marx. Working from a concrete and differentiated analysis of the social conditions in Western countries, Sitnikov should therefore have shown the necessity for the specific distortions, bias, and so forth from their very origins. In the case of the philosophers whom he criticized, instead of this he is content to conclude immediately that the pro-capitalistic apologia is based on critical arguments against Soviet Marxism and the mere fact of living in a Western, quote, capitalist, end quote, country. The simplistic classifications which are found in Sitnikov, and indeed in most other Soviet authors, can therefore scarcely be made the object of anti-critical discussion. I shall, to begin with, be content to define the motives which caused the Commission on Marxism of the Evangelical Study Group to turn to an examination of the young Marx. If I am correct in my assumptions, there were two main motives. First, the need to begin a philosophical examination of Marxism at the point where Marxism's true depth and most substantial central thought become apparent. Examination merely of the latter form which Engels, Lenin, and Stalin gave to Marxism would have seemed to us an all too simple polemical method. The second motive for the thorough study of Marx's early writings was horror at the fact that such clearly humanistic intentions could have led, particularly in the era of Stalin, to such evidently inhumane phenomenon as the mass persecution of leading communists, the deportation of whole racial groups. Never forget that. Um, Never forget that. I'm sorry. Just wanted to say that. And the suppression of, quote, socialist legality, end quote. The problem which constantly disturbed us was as follows. Was this development necessary? Did its roots lie in Marx, or did something, quote, go wrong, end quote, with the development? Did the outbreak and victory of revolution in a backward agricultural country make some contribution toward the fact that socialism, as it developed, looked quite different from what Marx and Marxists had imagined in the 19th century? The various contributors to the Marxism Studien and other authors named by Sitnikov have certainly not all given the same answer to this question. I personally tend to consider that it was above all Stalin's efforts to, quote, build socialism in one backward agrarian end country, end quote, which led to something being called, quote, socialism, end quote, which must surely bring the revolution into discredit for the workers in the developed industrial countries of the West and force the Soviet leadership to solve a problem which Marx could never have foreseen, namely to catch up with technically much more developed capitalist countries. In this competition between the capitalist and socialist countries to bring about an increase in production and productivity, it was almost inevitable that in a backward country, humanistic aims must take second place in technical progress. Must take place to technical progress, which became a fetish, while at the same time it was suggested to the population through official propaganda, which conflicted more and more sharply with reality, that socialist targets were being reached in a number of stages. I therefore refuse to make Marx and Engels, quote, completely responsible, end quote, for a development which, as I have learned precisely from Marx, was determined by social and political factors, with a significant contribution from ideological attitudes. But we have now come to the crux of this discussion. Let us examine point by point the arguments followed by Sitnikov in the above extracts from his book, The Problem of Alienation in Bourgeois Philosophy and Distortions of Marxism. Section A. Marxist Humanism. Sitnikov claims that Metzger, Thier, and Iring Fetscher, deny the humanism of the mature Marx because the notion of alienation scarcely plays a role in the book Capital. I would formulate the statement differently. Certainly the humanist intention is retained in Capital, and the humanist Certainly the humanist intention is retained in the book Capital, and in the book Capital's analysis of the fetishist nature of the commodity lies methodologically on the same lines as the notion of alienation, but in the end to give a sure scientific basis to the hope which is placed in the revolution, the accent is shifted from this intention and the aim, namely the abolition of alienated work, and only, or almost exclusively, the, quote, natural law of development, end quote, in capitalist society is examined. This shift in emphasis, we concluded, and our conclusion was confirmed by reading the publication of most Marxists, led to a narrowing of the philosophy of Marxism. Leading authors such as Rudolf Hilferding considered the Marxist doctrine as a mere theory of economic development, and Kautsky therefore felt the need to complete Marx's work by his own (naturalist) ethics, which although he rejected the neo-Kantian moral philosophers. But not only this combination of Marxist doctrine limited to a theory of development of society similar to that of Darwin, with certain ethical doctrines, but also the reduction of Marxism to the mere question of the rate of economic and technical development seemed to us to be a possible consequence of this shift in emphasis. And we further consider that the early writings were partially accessible, the Paris manuscripts, however, only after 1932, but played no role whatever in the propagation of Marxism, while Kautsky's book, Karl Marx's Economic Theories, was published and read everywhere, last Russian translation 1956, last Ukrainian version 1957, it becomes completely understandable that the humanistic intentions which Marx, and to a certain extent also Engels, took for granted must be swept under the table or paid only lip service. Stalin's formula of the, quote, requirements of the development of the productive forces, end quote, is characteristic of the reduction of Marxism to a doctrine of optimal conditions for the development of production techniques. For Marx, however, the absolute aim was not maximum production, even if he felt a considerable increase in production to be necessary so as to bring about a general satisfaction of needs, but the abolition of alienation and the general development of the human potentialities in all individuals. There's a footnote. Stalin, quote, so as not to make a mistake in politics, the party of the proletariat must start the party of the proletariat's activity, not from the abstract principles of human reason, but, from the real requirements for the development of material life in society, end quote. Stalin, Dialectical and Historical Materialism. Quoted from the text with commentary in the edited volume edited by Iring Fetscher, where the critical comment on Stalin's terminology will also be found. End footnote. New section. B. Hegelianization of Marx. The reproach that I, in the company of Georg Lukács as author of History of Class Consciousness, the approach that I, in the company of Georg Lukács as author of History of Class Consciousness, I think it's probably supposed to be History and Class Consciousness. Unless History of Class Consciousness is a separate book by Fetscher, but I don't think it is. The reproach that I, in the company of Georg Lukács, as author of History of Class Consciousness, am responsible for a, quote, Hegelianization of Marx, end quote, is not in reality a criticism. Sitnikov's entire refutation consists in quoting a comment by Marx on Bruno Bauer, which is supposed also to apply to me as an idealistic left-wing Hegelian. The Hegelianization of Marx cannot, however, be accepted as an objection when it can be proved that it does justice to Marx and that his own central thought was dialectical and Hegelian. I shall attempt to indicate this in a few sentences. The starting point must be Marx's thought that the proletarian revolution, unlike all previous revolutions, is to be implemented with a completely adequate consciousness of its significance and extent. Whereas in 1789 the French middle classes honestly believed that they were fighting for the, quote, liberté, égalité, et fraternité, end quote, of all, the French middle classes did not realize that the objective purpose of this revolution was simply to free the new, quote, capitalist conditions of production, end quote, and to build a corresponding political superstructure. The French middle classes served, as it were, as blind tools of a historical law which was working behind their backs. Matters are different, according to Marx, with the revolutionary proletariat. The revolutionary proletariat will abolish itself and at the same time capitalist society, the last form of class society, in and by the proletariat's revolution, therefore create at least one precondition for the withering away of the state and the end of history as a development which men had to endure. While behind the revolutionary bourgeoisie only a, quote, imaginary, end quote, subject of history could be constructed, because it only apparently achieved its conscious plans, the proletariat will instead be able to achieve its aims in reality. The reality, namely society, becomes such an urgent force at this unique moment of history that at the same time the revolutionary thought which forces its way through to reality finds an ideal fertile soil in the proletariat. The proletariat can be justly defined as the subject-object of history because the proletariat is at one and the same time the substrate of the process of abolition of itself as a dependent class and also the subject of the abolition itself. Because the proletariat forms the society, at least society's overwhelming majority according to Marx, which is revolutionized, and also the collective subject which implements the revolution. Section C. Lukács, Lenin, and the role of the party. In 1932, Georg Lukács was the first to develop again his interpretation of historical materialism, which is based on the young Marx. Lukács was then very soon violently attacked by orthodox Marxists in both camps, by Kautsky and the Leninists. Lenin himself was no longer able to read this particular book, but protest strongly against an earlier political article by Lukács. However, it is perfectly possible to combine Lukács' position with the Leninist Party theory, at least such as the opinion of Morris Watnick who has a wide knowledge of the subject. Who is Morris Watnick? I don't see anything. It looks like Morris Watnick wrote a book called Georg Lukács, A Life of Alienated Sensibility, but I don't see anything else. Back to the text. However, it is perfectly possible to combine Lukács's position with the Leninist party theory, at least such is the opinion of Morris Watnick, who had a wide knowledge of the subject. Lukács emphasizes, in fact, that the subject of the revolution is in no way the empirical proletariat, which, as Lenin emphasized in regard to Kautsky, is unable on its own to develop a politico-revolutionary class consciousness, but the proletariat, quote, as a subject to which historical action can be attributed, end quote. That is, the imaginary proletariat visualized by the theoreticians of Marxism and which can serve as a justification for their decisions. If, however, I am of the opinion that there is an essential difference on this point between Lukács and Lenin, that is because Lenin distinguishes the empirical proletariat from the party in an undialectical manner by placing the entire political initiative on the side of the party and simply seeing in the proletarian mass as a part of the army which will fight the campaign against the bourgeois capitalists. In other words, because he makes the party leader a guardian, which in the end cannot be controlled from below, of the proletariat instead of an aid in the process towards developing class consciousness. To speak in terms of, quote, transmission belts, end quote, parenthesis, the mass organizations, end parenthesis, and, quote, levers, end quote, with the help of which the party, parenthesis, as the locomotive of the revolution, end parenthesis, must set the inner proletarian mass in movement, is here more revealing than to speak in terms which remain rhetorical of the, quote, creative force of the masses, end quote, which de facto created the Soviets in 1905 and 1917, but certainly did not create the elements of the Constitution of 1937. There's a footnote here that I missed. Okay, so the Morris Watnick piece that was in that is being referred to here is titled Relativism and Class Consciousness, Georg Lukács, in Revisionism, Essays on the History of Marxist Ideas. And the other footnote is Rosa Luxemburg, Organisationsfragen der russischen Sozialdemokratie. I think that's organizational problems of Russian social democracy, or it could be organization questions. I can't remember what the actual general translation is, but I do know my limited German tells me that Fragen, I believe, means, or close to my understanding, maybe I'm wrong, but I think Fragen means question. So, Rosa Luxemburg's Organizational Problems of Russian Social Democracy in Neue Zeit, Volume 22, and Rosa Luxemburg's Die Russische Revolution. I don't know how you say revolution in German. From the Posthumous Writings, edited by Paul Levy. In Paul Levy's introduction, we read, quote, for Lenin, the proletariat can quite evidently be divided into two sharply distinct sections, one section which attracts and the other which is attracted, and the connection between these two sections is as the image of attraction, or the symbol of the, quote, lever, end quote, which is so often used, shows taken from mechanics. For Lenin, both sections are capable of a separate existence. The vanguard of the proletariat, which has been created by and carries the Soviet system, can live and exist and continue to support that system until the great mass of people make use of the, quote, possibility, end quote, offered to them and have, quote, learned by experience, end quote, to detect their, quote, most reliable leaders, end quote, end quote. Levy, or Levi. Then there is the broad mass of exploited and suppressed people, I guess this is a continuation of the quote. I'm not sure. Then there is the broad mass of exploited and suppressed people, ... the object to which the, quote, lever, end quote, is applied, and on which the art of the lever is exercised until the day when they recognize the blessing of the possibilities offered to them in the Soviet system and the faithful forethought of their, quote, utterly reliable leaders, end quote, and are absorbed into what was previously the vanguard. Like a faithful mother, the vanguard in the Soviet system has tailored a shirt to the size of its grown-up children and waits patiently or impatiently until the children can wear the shirt. Until then, the mother remains a mother, and the shirt is a shirt, and the shirt a shirt. The vanguard a vanguard, and the Soviet system, end quote. It is therefore, I'm not sure who that quote is from. I don't know if that's still from Levy. I haven't seen anything. I think that's all from Paul Levy. End quote. It is therefore not only the, quote, authors of... it is therefore not only the authors of, quote, anti-communist rubbish, end quote, who, as Sitnikov asserts, have cast doubts on Lenin's party theory and the relationship which he assumes between the party and the working class. End footnote. The practical substitution of the party for the class, however, is theoretically pregnant with consequences. The practical substitution of the party for the class served, in fact, to eliminate the radical difference between all earlier revolutions and the proletarian revolution. Lenin was able to speak unhesitantly of the, quote, Jacobins who have entered into an alliance with the proletarian movement, end quote, as though no gulf should separate the proletarian from the bourgeois revolution. And while for Marx the highly serious problem remained of how the new society should arise from the old, which contaminates all men living within it, the revolutionary followers of Lenin were unflinching in their conviction that they were the chosen leaders and educators of the masses. In this context, I would like to recall a part of the third of the theses on Feuerbach. Quote, the materialist doctrine concerning the transformation of circumstances in education forgets that circumstances are transformed by men and that the educator himself has to be educated. Consequently, this doctrine is bound to divide society into two parts, one of which is superior to society, end quote. This objection is fully applicable to the Leninist elite party, which sets itself up as infallible, even after the errors of Stalin and the decisions taken during his, quote, reign, end quote, by the Central Committee are claimed not to have lost their character of infallibility. Here and in the German ideology, Marx saw only one solution to the following dilemma. Bad conditions result in bad men. And to create better conditions, we first need better men. Where, then, do we begin? This solution leads us back to the thought which Sitnikov dismisses as, quote, Hegelian, end quote. Marx continues, quote, the coincidences of the transformation of circumstances and of human activity or self-transformation can be grasped and rationally understood only as revolutionary practice. Revolutionary practice, end quote. Revolutionary practice is in italics. Marx. In the German ideology, we read in the same vein, quote, that therefore the revolution is not only necessary because the ruling class cannot be toppled in any other way but also because only in a revolution can the class which brings about this movement get rid of all the old junk and become capable of founding a new society, end quote. Marx. This simply means that the proletariat, by simultaneously transforming the circumstances and itself, is the, quote, subject-object, end quote, which bursts the bounds of the previous society and the human beings stamped by it, and so makes itself capable of founding a new socialist and communist order. There can be no question that either I or other authors on the Commission on Marxism considered this revolutionary process to be spontaneous. Marx certainly demands the maximum conscious effort as a prerequisite for the transfer to action, the other condition lying with the objective socio-economic circumstances. What we do feel has no basis in Marx is the replacement of this collective action by the class, which also liberates that class's self from the past in the revolution, a class which is also supposed to form a majority of society, by the actions of a party elite, which works on the basis of the proletariat, and above all the peasant masses as a means to achieve power. Through this substitution, the proletarian revolution, as conceived by Marx, becomes a modified version of the bourgeois revolution. This seems to me not to be a historical accident, because in reality, in 1917, Russia still had to make good a considerable measure of development already achieved in the capitalist industrial countries. The term, quote, state capitalism, end quote, used occasionally by Lenin may not be logically tenable, but corresponds well with the functional historical sense of the state order which he built up. One might also speak of a bureaucratic, quote, surrogate capitalism, end quote. I do not believe that authors criticized by Sitnikov wish to deny the role of the political parties, but they would surely all deny that a party can be made into the sole legitimate subject of history. Lenin's party claims a monopoly, at least in representation of the will of the toiling masses, and accuses every party which competes for the votes of these electors of evil intentions, of evil intentions or blatant ignorance. I would say that's also true for people within the Bolshevik Party. There's like a famous quote, some thing with like Lenin saying like Bukharin or something like that. I think it was Bukharin. It was definitely Bukharin. Bukharin himself has no understanding of dialectical materialism, and it's like, I don't know who I heard that from. I think I was in like one of the talks from Simon Perani's excellent defunct YouTube channel. That has a bunch of lectures from top historians about the social history of various revolutions, and one of them, I want to say it was Christopher Reed, but I'm not sure. But basically, what the book what the guy says is like something like, if Nikolai Bukharin, if dialectical materialism and the understanding of it is some kind of like essential prerequisite for a socialist revolution, and the top theoretician doesn't understand dialectical materialism, which I think you could definitely argue that Nikolai Bukharin was the top theoretician of the Bolshevik Party, at least on a long-standing basis. You could argue that Trotsky was another leading theoretician, but remember that Trotsky didn't become a Bolshevik until 1917, during the provisional government period. Prior being part of the, what's it called? Trotsky was part of the Mezryansia, which is like, I think, Russian for interdistrict, so like kind of like trying to mediate a reunification of the Menshevik and Bolshevik wings of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. But yeah, so basically, but to get back to the thing that I was saying is like, okay, like your top theoretician, or like one of the top theoreticians at the very least, had no understanding of dialectical materialism. I don't know where I was actually going with this, but what I was saying is that this like accusation of anyone who's not a Bolshevik of like evil intentions or blatant ignorance is not something that's restricted to people outside of the Bolshevik Party, and it's not excluded to people who are like, not at the top of the party either. Like other people within the Bolshevik Party who disagree with Lenin either have evil intentions or are idiots. Anyway, back to the text. Lenin's party claims a monopoly, at least to representation of the will of the toiling masses, and accuses every party which competes for the votes of these electors of evil intentions or blatant ignorance. Lenin's party attempts to win over this population not by, quote, scientific enlightenment, end quote, but by agitation which appeals to fantasy and sentiment. It makes use of the psychological know-how. Democratic parties obviously act in a similar way, but their activity is generally limited by the competing efforts of other parties, which therefore exert a certain controlling function. Where this competition is lacking and its necessity denied for ideological reasons, which need not necessarily be derived from Marxist doctrine, dangerous consequences, to say the least, may occur, as they certainly did in the Stalin era. This development of a party which acts as the guardian of the, quote, toiling masses, end quote, evidently corresponds to the development of Marxism into a more and more comprehensive Weltanschauung. What Sitnikov does not present to his Soviet readers is that part of my essay in which I show how the non-arrival of the revolution and the strengthening of a radical Marxist workers' movement in Germany, which was condemned to inactivity, in particular under the exceptional law against socialists, contributed to the development of this philosophy, and how even the greater limitation of the political freedoms of action of the socialists did in old Russia led to an even stronger emphasis on general philosophical questions, until finally the theory which was related to practice was replaced by a doctrine which, in my convinced opinion, is as alienated from the proletariat and the Soviet workers as religion was according to Marx. Like the aspect of religion which Marx defined as ideology, this philosophy has the function of reconciling Soviet man with the unsatisfactory social and cultural reality of everyday life, while stifling critical comment. A Swiss Marxist stated some years ago to the astonished Soviet philosopher Kedrov, it says Bonifati Kedrov, who lived from 1903 to 1985 in Moscow, was a Soviet researcher, philosopher, logician, chemist, and psychologist who was a specialist in the philosophy of dialectical materialism and the philosophy of science. Son of the Bolshevik leader Mikhail Kedrov, he himself joined the Bolsheviks in 1918. Kedrov had a Doctor of Philosophy degree and specialized in philosophical questions of the natural sciences. Kedrov was a member of the Academy of Sciences of the Soviet Union since 1966, author of over 1,000 publications. Since 1963, Kedrov was a member of the International Academy of the History of Science and a number of other institutions. Kedrov was one of the initiators and the first editor-in-chief of Problems of Philosophy, a leading Soviet journal of philosophy from 1947 to 1949. So that's who Kedrov is. So back to the text. A Swiss Marxist stated some years ago to the astonished Soviet philosopher Kedrov, who had just given a lecture on the, quote, hierarchy of sciences, end quote, that the theme and problems presented in his lecture clearly reflected the hierarchical order of Soviet society and were fatally reminiscent of Auguste Comte's hierarchy of science, which was matched in social concept by the domination of engineers, bankers, and sociologists in the Comte school. I want to see if there's anything for Comte's hierarchy of science. Wikipedia says, the hierarchy of sciences. Yeah, Wikipedia says, the hierarchy of science is a theory formulated by Auguste Comte in the 19th century. This theory states that science develops over time, beginning with the simplest and most general scientific discipline, astronomy, which is the first to reach the, quote, positive stage, end quote, one of three in Comte's law of three stages. As one moves up the, quote, hierarchy, end quote, this theory further states that science becomes more complex and less general, and that they will reach the positive stage later. Disciplines further up the hierarchy are said to depend more on the developments of their predecessors. The highest discipline on the hierarchy are the social sciences. According to this theory, there are higher levels of consensus and faster rates of advancement in physics and other natural sciences than there are in the social sciences. There's another section in here that says evidence. I want to read. Research has shown that after controlling for the number of hypotheses being tested, positive results are 2.3 times more likely in the social sciences than in the physical sciences. It has also been found that the degree of scientific consensus is highest in physical sciences, lowest in the social sciences, and intermediate in the biological sciences. Dean Simonton argues that a composite measure of the scientific status of disciplines ranks psychology much closer to biology than to sociology. Interesting. So, back to the text. A Swiss Marxist stated some years ago to the astonished Soviet philosopher Kedrov, who had just given a lecture on the history of sciences, that the theme and problems presented in his lecture clearly reflected the hierarchical order of Soviet society and were fatally reminiscent of Auguste Comte's hierarchy of science, which was matched in social concept by the domination of engineers, bankers, and sociologists in the Comte school. This observation also coincides with my own thesis that the revolutionary theory has been transformed into a reified Weltanschauung, which functions as an ideological complement to a new type of hierarchical society. And if you don't know what Weltanschauung means, it just means worldview. Wikipedia says a worldview, or a worldview with a hyphen in between, or a dash. I don't fucking know. Forget the words. Forget what the symbols mean are called. Weltanschauung is the fundamental cognitive orientation of an individual or society, encompassing the whole of the individual's or society's knowledge, culture, and point of view. A worldview can include natural philosophy, fundamental existential and normative postulates or themes, values, emotions, and ethics. Back to the text. While the later development of Marxism appears extremely problematical to the student who starts out from the early writings of Marx, the departure from the late rigorously defined form of dialectical materialism leads, on the other hand, inevitably to a misconstruction of the meaning of Marx's theories. I should like to illustrate this with a particularly striking example. In Marx's introduction to a critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, published in 1844 in the Deutsch Französische Jahrbuch, we find the following statement, quote, philosophy cannot be realized without the abolition of the proletariat, but the proletariat cannot be abolished without the realization of philosophy, end quote. Marx. Footnote. The fact that infinite progress equals bad infinity tends more and more to take the place of the crowning completion of history is explained by the evident preponderance of natural, scientific, and technical thought in, quote, dialectical materialism, end quote. Lenin emphasizes, e.g., the infinite progress, never reaching its aims, of natural knowledge. The, quote, atom is inexhaustible, end quote. Already in Engels, this unbroken belief in progress, which was shared by almost all his contemporaries, is accompanied by a new version based on natural science over the ancient cyclical theory. On this subject, the Dialectics of Nature, the book Dialectics of Nature, quote, it is an eternal cycle in which matter moves, a cycle which only completes its progression in ages, for which our earthly calendar ceases to be an adequate measure, a cycle in which the age of higher development, the age of organic life, and still more the age of living beings, Christ, where the hell is a... which are aware of themselves and of nature, is as briefly measured as the space in which life and self-consciousness come into life and self-consciousness's own, a cycle in which ... nothing is eternal other than eternally self-transforming and moving matter and the laws according to which it moves and changes. End quote. Dialectic of nature. Engels. Engels refers specifically in this context to the, quote, genius of Greek intuition, end quote, which has now been confirmed by the achievements of natural science. There is scarcely any doubt that Marx's concept of history was concerned neither with the infinite progress of natural science and technology, nor yet with the eternal cycle of cosmic events, but exclusively, or at least centrally, with the fate of men and their social life. This fate, he assumed, would be controlled after the proletarian revolution by free men themselves, and therefore turned to exclusively good ends. Soviet Marxists generally find it difficult to choose between these three time structures, but it seems necessary to opt for one or the other, or to determine their respective areas of applicability. All right. End footnote. Come on. Let's go back. Here we are. All right. Soviet or Soviet Marxist authors repeatedly misconstrue the word, quote, philosophy, end quote, in this sentence as a synonym for historical materialism or a theory of the laws of development of society. This is not only the case with Sitnikov, but with his German colleagues Bregner and Jahn. I wonder if that's referring to Wolfgang Jahn. That's the only East German Marxist I know. Not really seeing anything for Bergner. Let me see. Yeah, I don't think this is... Yeah. I'm not seeing anything for Jan. It's not only the case with Sitnikov, but with his German colleagues Bergner and Jahn, who state in their Der Kreuzzug der Evangelischen Akademien gegen Marxismus, the crusade of the evangelical academics against Marxism in 1960, quote, what appearance philosophy should take on, that is, the philosophy which was to be embodied in the revolutionary action of the proletariat, what areas it was to cover, and what its relationship was to be with the individual disciplines of science. All this remained the object of future studies, end quote, and could not have been known by Marx at this time. If we know the writings of the young Marx better and also take into account contemporary works by other authors, the meaning of the sentence we have just quoted is, however, clear. The philosophy which is expected here to be realized is not the theory concerning the way toward the socialist revolution, or the means by which it can be achieved, but the concept of free, unalienated men who have joined together in a human society. In other words, it is philosophical humanism whose realization in the concrete sense is anticipated and hoped for by Marx, not the development of a comprehensive Weltanschauung, or worldview, which serves as a roof over all the individual sciences and their methodological principles. Here again it is quite clear how the reified Weltanschauung has replaced the revolutionary theory. How... Come on. Sorry, it's like taking a minute to like get through, like switch pages. The concept of humanistic philosophy, with a clearly defined content, has been displaced by the theory of the development of society, whose meaning can only be sought in the achievement of that distant aim. In sociological terms, one might explain this blindness to the meaning of the concepts used by the young Marx, by the fact that all the above-mentioned authors live in societies which have made their increase of production a socialist purpose in itself, instead of a means to an end, and placed infinite progress, the bad infinity mentioned by Hegel, in the position occupied by a concrete aim. Just as a side note from me, there's a very good quote in I don't know if he's probably kind of a right-winger, or is a right-winger. Stephen Kotkin, who wrote a book on Magnitogorsk, which was like a huge development project in the Soviet Union, and everything kind of oriented around, what the fuck was I believe? What were they doing? About a mine. I think it was like all built around a mine. That's why it was there. And and it was all centered around like production. And it's like if you build a mine, or you build a steel plant or something like that, that's from the source of civilization in the eyes of the Soviets. And then he says, well, as a matter of fact, just building the plant in and of itself was civilization. The building of the plant was civilization, which I think is very applicable to what Iring Fetscher is saying here. Let me reread that sentence. In sociological terms, one might explain this blindness to the meaning of the concepts used by the young Marx by the fact that above all, the above-mentioned authors live in societies which have made the mere increase of production a socialist purpose in itself instead of a means to an end, and placed infinite progress. The bad infinity mentioned by Hegel in the position occupied previously by a concrete aim. New section. Alienation in the East and West. In the final part of the sections of Sitnikov's book, which I have produced, he manages as little as to represent correctly the arguments of the authors whom he criticizes as in the other parts. Sitnikov asserts, for example, that we hide, quote, the cruelest capitalist reality behind God, end quote. But I know of at least a few theologians in our working group who feel, like Karl Barth, that the Marxist critique of ideologies can be used as a valuable means of distinguishing between Christian faith and the social misuse of religion to defend traditional political or social conditions. According to Wikipedia, Karl Barth, who lived from 1886 to 1968, was a Swiss Reformed theologian. Barth is best known for his commentary to the Epistle to the Romans, Barth's involvement in the Confessing Church, including his authorship except for a single phrase of the Barmen Declaration, and especially his unfinished multi-volume theological Summa, the Church Dogmatics, published between 1932 and 1967. Barth's influence expanded well beyond the academic realm to mainstream culture, leading Barth to be referred to on the cover of Time on the 20th, leading Barth to be featured on the cover of Time on the 20th of April 1962. Like many Protestant theologians of his generation, Barth was educated in a liberal theology influenced by Adolf von Harnack, Friedrich Schleiermacher, and others. Karl Barth's pastoral career began in the rural Swiss town of Zoffinville, where he was known as the, quote, Red Pastor from Zoffinville, end quote. There, Karl Barth became increasingly disillusioned with the liberal Christianity in which Karl Barth had been trained. This led Karl Barth to write the first editions of his Epistle to the Romans, aka Romans 1, published in 1919, in which Karl Barth resolved to read the New Testament differently. Barth began to gain substantial worldwide acclaim with the publication in 1921 of the second edition of Barth's commentary, the Epistle to the Romans, in which Karl Barth openly broke from liberal theology. Karl Barth influenced many significant theologians such as Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who supported the Confessing Church, and Jürgen Moltmann, Helmut Goldwitzer, James H. Kohn, Wolfhard Pannenberg, Rudolf Bultmann, Thomas F. Torrance, Hans Kung, and also Reinhold Niebuhr, Jacques Ellul, and novelists such as Flannery O'Connor, John Updike, and Miklos Zentkuti. Among many other areas, Karl Barth has also had a profound influence on modern Christian ethics, including the work of ethicists such as Stanley Hauerwas, John Howard Yoder, Jacques Ellul, and Oliver O'Donovan. So that's Karl Barth. I knew it was an important name, but I didn't remember which way. Back to the text. But I know of at least a few theologians in our working group who feel, like Karl Barth, that the Marxist critique of ideologies can be used as a valuable means of distinguishing between Christian faith and the social misuse of religion to defend traditional political or social conditions. Everything which is covered by the Marxist critique, and in their own opinion this includes not least traditional church Christianity, must be washed away by the flood of constant criticism of ideology so as to reveal all the more clearly the core of true faith. Wherever, in other words, Christianity is used consciously or unconsciously to veil inhuman conditions, there these theologians are ready to join Marx in his protest, not, however, in identifying and condemning religion with this camouflage, but in order to liberate and discern religion from this pernicious combination. In addition, the Commission on Marxism also concerned itself for a long time with the problem of knowing whether, apart from individual guilt and sin, there is also some form of structural guilt and sin which may be imminent in certain social circles and political systems. A number of members on our commission believed this to be the case. However, some of them were skeptical as regards the possibility of eliminating these structural evils without trace, and the example of Soviet society seemed to justify their skepticism perfectly. Because of their schooling in Marxist thinking, it was impossible for them to accept the official Soviet explication of the distortions in democracy and the, quote, infringements of socialist law, end quote, in the age of the, quote, Stalinist cult of the personality, end quote, as mere products of the peculiar individual features of Stalin. In every society there are many individuals with the character of Stalin, but only in societies with a specific constitution can individuals with the character of Stalin remain in power for decades. We therefore find it less astonishing and less worthy of criticism that Stalin could be placed at the head of the party against the advice of Lenin, than that Stalin could maintain himself there for so long and be able to sweep out his path all immediate and potential enemies and opponents. Among the leading communist theoreticians, Palmiro Togliatti was evidently the only one to recognize this problem, but when Palmiro Togliatti tried to draw attention to it, he was condemned immediately to silence. Palmiro Togliatti was the leader of the Communist Party of Italy. He's like the one who I think he like went out over like Bordiga was ostracized, Gramsci died, and Togliatti took it over. Is generally the more or less scheme that at least I have in my head, of the history of the Italian Communist Party. Palmiro Michel Nicola Tagliati, who lived in 1893 to 1964, was an Italian politician and statesman, leader of Italy's Communist Party for nearly 40 years, from 1927 until his death. Born in a middle-class family, Tagliati received an education in law at the University of Turin. Later served as an officer and was wounded in World War I and became a tutor. Described as, quote, severe in approach but extremely popular among the communist base, end quote, a hero of his time, capable of courageous personal defeats, end quote. Tagliati's supporters gave him the nickname Il Migliore, the, quote, best, end quote. In 1930, Tagliati renounced Italian citizenship and he became a citizen of the Soviet Union. Upon his death, Tagliati had a Soviet city named after him. Considered one of the founding fathers of the Italian Republic, Palmiro Tagliati led Italy's Communist Party from a few thousand members in 1943 to 2 million members in 1946. Born in Genoa but culturally formed in Turin, during the first decades of the 1900s, when the first Fiat workshops were built and the Italian labor movement began its battles, Tagliati's history is linked to that of Lingotto. Tagliati helped launch the left-wing weekly L'Ordine Nouveau in 1919 and was the editor of Il Comunista starting in 1922. Tagliati was a founding member of the Communist Party of Italy, which was founded as the result of a split from the Italian Socialist Party in 1921. In 1926, the Communist Party of Italy was made illegal alongside the other parties by Benito Mussolini's government. Tagliati was able to avoid the destiny of many of his fellow party members who were arrested only because he was in Moscow at the time. From 1927 until Tagliati's death, Tagliati was the secretary and leader of the Italian Communist Party, except for the period from 1934 to 1938, during which Tagliati served as representative to the Comintern, the international organization of communist parties, earning the Il Giurista del Comintern, the jurist of the Comintern nickname from Leon Trotsky. After the dissolution of the Comintern in 1943 and the formation of the Common Forum in 1947, Tagliati refused the post of Secretary General offered to him directly by Joseph Stalin in 1951, preferring to remain at the head of the PCI, which was by now a mass-based party, the largest communist party in Western Europe. Tagliati's relations to Moscow were a continuing subject of scholarly and political debate after his death. From 1944 to 1945, Tagliati held the post of Deputy Prime Minister of Italy, and he was appointed Italian Minister of Justice from 1945 to 1946 in the governments that ruled Italy after the fall of fascism. Tagliati was also a member of the Constituent Assembly of Italy. Tagliati inaugurated the PCI's peaceful and national road to socialism, or the, quote, Italian road to socialism, end quote, the realization of the communist project through democracy, repudiating the use of violence, and applying the Italian constitution in all its parts, a strategy that some date back to Antonio Gramsci, and that would since be the leitmotif of the party's history. After Tagliati's death, it helped to further the liberalization among communist parties and countries. Tagliati was the first Italian communist to appear in television debates. Tagliati survived an assassination attempt in 1948, a car accident in 1950, and he died in 1964 during a holiday in the Crimea on the Black Sea. So that's who Palmiro Tagliati is. Back to the text. Among the leading communist theoreticians, Palmiro Tagliati was evidently the only one to recognize this problem, but when Tagliati tried to draw attention to this problem, he was condemned immediately to silence. Like other Soviet philosophers, Sitnikov energetically rejects the application of the category of alienation to Soviet society. Sitnikov's criticism has a two-pronged approach. First, Sitnikov attacks my theory that there exist in, quote, socialist societies, end quote, alienated labor and alienated relationships between individuals and the state, political superstructure, and individuals and culture, ideological superstructure. On the other hand, Sitnikov disputes that in Western societies serious efforts are being made to overcome, or at least to lessen alienation in the labor process. I should like an answer to specify certain of my arguments once again. Marx traces alienation back to two roots: to private ownership of the means of production, and to the, quote, servile subjection of to the division of labor, end quote. Since in the Soviet Union, private ownership of the means of production has, with a few exceptions, been abolished, the first essential step to overcoming alienation appears to have been taken. In fact, however, very little has changed according to all our information in the real socio-psychologically verifiable relations between the worker and his factory or his activity. He still feels his working activity to be a means and the payment he receives to be the ultimate purpose. The principle of, quote, personal material interest, end quote, is still recommended as, quote, progressive, end quote, in the Soviet Union, not by chance, even though it differs little from the system of payment which has always dominated in capitalist industrial society. Tito and other, quote, revisionists, end quote, have therefore attempted by more direct participation of the workers in the management of their factories to make the fact of, quote, collective ownership, end quote, a reality which the workers themselves can experience. I do not propose to discuss here whether his efforts have been completely successful in Yugoslavia. The realization that formal legal takeover of ownership of the industrial means of production by the state does not bring about any abolition of the alienated relationship between the worker and his worker's work seems to me, however, to be accurate. If the new system of ownership is to mean anything for industrial workers would not left in East Germany in such large numbers to work generally in private capitalist concerns in West Germany for higher real wages. The failure to abolish alienation in the labor process is also accompanied in the Soviet Union and other socialist states by alienation from the bureaucratic state and party leadership. The continuously repeated invitation for increased, quote, utilization of the people for administrative tasks proves that, in spite of its express statements to the contrary, the leadership too recognizes this state of affairs. The language often betrays what it is meant to conceal. If the population is to be, quote, utilized, end quote, how can the population be the democratic ruler? And is it not still in the hands of guardians who educate it? And while these guardians who repeatedly assert that their will coincides with these people's, and while these guardians who repeatedly assert that the will coincides with that of their pupils, and is simply the rational expression of something which these pupils would themselves wish if they were fully conscious of their task, they are still clearly and even institutionally isolated from the population. The democratic metaphysics, which were already criticized by Marx and Hegel, cannot conceal political alienation any more than the legal fiction of people's ownership, which in reality corresponds to control by the bureaucracy of the means of production. Finally, however, I also feel that the relationship between the working masses and the Marxist-Leninist Weltanschauung is, as I have said earlier, a relationship with an alienated ideology. It is a question of doctrines which must be developed by specialists and with difficulty forced upon the consciousness from outside, not of insights which meet the requirements of the masses, because they contain the secret to their existence. I feel that a cause for the widespread fear of revisionism lies in the fact that revisionism corresponds better with the intellectual needs of the population, including many party members and leaders, than an ideology which, according to the confession of Soviet politicians themselves, tended to move farther and farther away from reality, especially in the Stalinist era. Sitnikov, in fact, makes things too easy for himself when at certain points in his critique he speaks not of the Soviet Union as it is today, but of the concept of the future presented in the new party program, which he then compares with the reality in Western industrial countries. I am willing to concede that in many respects, the communist world comes off best in such a comparison, but no reasonable comparison can be made between reality on the one hand and mere plans on the other. I do not claim that alienation has been overcome in the Western world, but I do feel that the problem is often taken more seriously here than it is in the Eastern Bloc countries, where the universal panacea to cure all social ills is thought to have already been found. The examples I have quoted, which scarcely relate to the human relations movement, but to much more concrete and practical instances, are merely intended to show how widespread such attempts are. These attempts have certainly not been promoted by all industrialists. The authorization to participate in decision-making functions, for example, meets with considerable resistance from them and represents an achievement by the trade unions whose leaders see in such forms of participation a more realistic way to achieve a democratic form of economy than in global nationalization. Finally, however, in Western societies where whole branches of industry have been nationalized, as in England, the right of the workers to strike has not been abolished because the social democratic governments recognize that conflict of interest still remains, when instead of owners and employed facing each other, there are administrators appointed by the government on the one hand and the workers on the other. Here again the democratic metaphysics is proved unrealistic. The question of interpretation of the laws of structure and movement in industrial societies, which have developed on the lines of an organized market economy, can only be sketched here. From the statements of Sitnikov, it is clear that he, like most other Soviet scholars, attempts, with the help of antiquated historical categories, monopoly capitalism, state monopoly capitalism, in vain to understand structures which have long since changed in many respects. One second. Again, I would not assert that these societies are, quote, ideal, end quote, in their present form, or indeed in any form, but I still feel that they allow the possibility of developments which lead far away from the old, quote, capitalist class society, end quote. Sitnikov himself admits that automation and automatic power play a part in this connection. I would like to add that the existence of a, quote, socialist world camp, end quote, as a competitor heightens the socio-political and economic efforts of the Western industrialized countries. Unemployment is today scarcely ever accepted as an inevitable accompanying factor in liberal economic systems, but is considered rather as an occasion for energetic countermeasures by the state. Wherever political freedom dominates and several parties must periodically woo the favor of the electors, these parties are obliged in broad measure to take into account the wishes of the electors, and this means also the working majority of electors. This does not lead to socialism as Marx conceived it, but it certainly prevents the maintenance of the old form of capitalism. The alienation of men has been overcome neither in the West or in the East, but this realization is not a cause of resignation, as Sitnikov hints. The obstacles which prevent its achievement in the West are primarily the one-sided orientation of men towards the demand for ever more consumer goods, which is evidently also presenting the Soviet leaders with increasing problems. It is an attitude which results in growing passivity and constant dissatisfaction in spite of the plethora of consumer goods. People's high schools, which give training in artistic and scientific activity and pleasure in such forms of activity, have proved one possible solution, particularly in Scandinavia. But in the Soviet Union, the major obstacle seems to me to lie in the power structure and the ideology which attempts to persuade the workers that by state ownership and the possibility of their identification with the creative general collective, alienation has already been overcome. This is a theory which one can attack with the same arguments which Marx employed against the assertion of the Democrats for whom the citizens of the state liberate themselves by identifying themselves with the state, its laws, and institutions. In both cases, freedom and the overcoming of alienation would be real only if it was no longer a compulsory ideology which determines in advance the free and rational decisions of the individuals, but instead the individuals themselves who are free to reach such a national decision for themselves. A part of this hope for freedom is still contained in the visions of the future for a perfect communist society. However, when Sitnikov declares that the quote, formulation and justification for social objectives will then still be a matter for science, which will need specialists, end quote, even this prospect becomes clouded. In a perfect state of communism, the aims should at least be set by the social beings in a human social society themselves, without the need for a special bureaucratic leadership. Only in order to achieve these aims would it be necessary to have economic and technical specialists whose decisions could be freely accepted on the basis of their evident understanding of the problems, and there would be no need for compulsory measures. It is scarcely by chance that Sitnikov speaks of experts who formulate and provide the reasons for the quote, social aims, end quote. Sitnikov evidently does not look, to use Marx's words, beyond the horizon of contemporary Soviet society, and in this society the aims are obviously still set by a small elite of party and state leaders. One is entitled, for example, to ask whether the expensive space program is really desired at the present moment in time as an object by the majority of Soviet citizens, or whether a more rational appraisal of needs, not an irrational nationalistic consideration, would perhaps call for increased residential building programs and extended production of consumer goods. For the political leaders of the Soviet Union, on the other hand, the successes in space evidently signify a highly desirable gain in prestige on the international level, quite apart from their military significance. This does not imply that similar groups and similar motives do not apply in the West. 2. Leading to exaggerated emphasis on the space program, the difference is that the United States is much more easily able to afford such a gigantic effort. But in that country too, there are critical scientific voices which condemn the expenditure as an immoral waste, while no such statements have been heard from the Soviet side. I have found it necessary repeatedly to compare conditions in the East and West for the purpose of my counter-critique. This is a method by which I do not set great store in itself, but Sitnikov has used it, and I am bound to follow him. A scarcely to be expected, but certainly conceivable result of my reply might be an improvement in the understanding of our critical motives in the face of Soviet Marxism, and a correction of that global and ungraduated presentation of which Sitnikov's work is itself an example. If criticism is to be more than a mutual change of insults, a clarifying discussion should be possible even between such divergent positions. I await Sitnikov's answer with great interest. New section. Postscript. After a delay of 2 years, M. Sitnikov, who has since become professor of philosophy and political economy at the Agricultural Institute in Ishchev, has answered my criticism under the heading of, quote, the Communist Party, an historically necessary condition to overcome the alienation of man, end quote. Sitnikov writes as follows in Scientific Reports from the Universities, quote, in the struggle which is currently being conducted by the world communist movement, and the discussions culminate in the examination of the problem of alienation, which remains one of the central points for bourgeois distortion of Marxism and attacks on communism. In an appendix to the weekly Das Parlament, or Parlement, Iring Fetscher, the author of Studies on Marxism, engages in a dispute with Soviet philosophers who discuss the problem of alienation. Making special critical reference to my own pamphlet, quote, Problems of Alienation in Bourgeois Philosophy and Distortions of Marxism, end quote, published in 1962. The statements of Fetscher are an accurate reflection of the methods by which anti-communist ideologies approach the notion of alienation. He attempts to negate the indispensability of the Communist Party by changing the young Marx into a Hegelian. The presentation of Marx at the time when the economic and philosophic manuscripts were written enjoys widespread attention in bourgeois literature, that is, at the time when Marx was a philosopher who hoped for an elementary movement of society, thanks to a spontaneously developing proletarian consciousness which might be formed independently of the activity of the Communist Party. Iring Fetscher and other authors try to interpret Marx as though he equated the workers' organization and alienation of man. End quote. Sitnikov. In a note on the last sentence, Sitnikov adds, quote, Unfortunately, a similar standpoint is also to be found in the works of some communists. End quote. In reality, I have neither equated the workers' organizations as such with alienation, nor have asserted that Marx did this, but simply characterized a specific bureaucratic form of the Communist Party as a phenomenon of alienation. The assertion that this changes Marx into a Hegelian idealist has already been presented by Sitnikov in his pamphlet, and it becomes no more convincing for being repeated. Quote, At the center of the dispute is the question whether the proletariat is capable of independent revolutionary activity without the leadership of a revolutionary party, without its organizational and propaganda work. Even if we consider the early works of Marx, in which there is no explicit mention made of the indispensability of the party, we can still find in them a demand for the organization of the proletarian movement, which inevitably leads to the forming of an avant-garde. End quote. Sitnikov. This is, first of all, an unfounded assertion, since Marx never speaks in so many words of a, quote, revolutionary avant-garde, end quote. And secondly, I have never asserted that the organization of a class in the form of a party is superfluous. What I have repeatedly emphasized is the need for a truly democratic relationship between the masses and their party. This explains my criticism of formulas such as, quote, increased utilization of the masses by the party, end quote, because such formulas suggest that not the masses or the demos are the subject of political action, but the bureaucratic elite, which attempts with its educational and propaganda organs to cause the masses to act in the way they would like them to act. The meaning of leadership by the Communist Party consists precisely in arousing the masses to activity, developing and supporting this activity, because the destruction of capitalism, this is a quote, the meaning of leadership by the Communist Party consists precisely in arousing the masses to activity, developing and supporting this activity, because the destruction of capitalism and the construction of socialism is the work of the masses, ... The Marxist Party, in future a real party of all peoples, does not lead to alienation of men, but to a genuine and historically necessary autodetermination of the masses, end quote. Sitnikov. Here Sitnikov is speaking of the future as envisaged in the party programs. My own arguments and those of other critics, including recently even Adam Schaff. I actually have a piece by Adam Schaff on this paper, on this channel, which you might find interesting. Adam Schaff was a Polish Marxist philosopher who lived from 1913 to 2006. His works include Word and Concept, Language and Cognition, Introduction to Semantics, Problems of the Marxist Theory of Truth, A Philosophy of Man. his belief says, of Jewish origin. Adam Schaff was born in Lemberg, Lviv, into a lawyer's family. Adam Schaff studied economics at the École des Sciences Politiques et Économiques in Paris, and philosophy in Poland, specializing in epistemology. In 1945, Adam Schaff received a philosophy degree at Moscow University, and in 1948 he returned to Warsaw University. Adam Schaff was considered the official ideologue of the Polish United Workers' Party, especially during its Stalinist period. So yeah, I have a piece by him because it was in the Erich Fromm's edited volume, the Socialist Humanism Compendium. I'm not sure exactly the title. Something like that. So that's who Adam Schaff is. My own arguments and those of other critics, including recently even Adam Schaff, concerns the present conditions, and any realistic criticism must concern itself with existing reality. The manner in which the, quote, activity of the masses, end quote, has so far been aroused, supported, and developed by the party is highly peculiar. The masses have always been told in the past what sort of activity would be theirs in the future. Rosa Luxemburg objected to this form of tutelage as long ago as 1918, and I was referring to the same situation. With similar arguments, Sitnikov also attempts to clear the socialist state of the reproach of alienation. Quote, Fetscher and Fetscher's colleagues see in the socialist state one of the forms of alienation of man. This is either a misunderstanding or an intentional distortion of the essence of the problem. Quote, an essential feature of the state, end quote, writes Engels, quote, consists in the public authority which exists isolated from the mass of the people, end quote. The complete isolation and alienation of the public power from the mass of the people seems, however, only to be typical of those countries in which exploitation is practiced. The socialist state is certainly not an authority which is alien to the working class. The majority of the population, even though the positions of public authority are characterized again by the usual separation and isolation of the apparatus of administration. The process of development towards social self-administration in the period of transition to communism results in the gradual elimination of this separation and isolation. In social society, the support of the state by the people already eliminates political alienation, so that here the isolation of the administrative functions has a totally different character from that in capitalism. End quote. Sitnikov. Apart from the repeated reference to the future socialist self-administrative bodies which will no longer be isolated from the population, Sitnikov is once again content to make an unfounded assertion. If the support of the state by the people would already be sufficient to eliminate alienation, there would then be political alienation in democratic states only at the moment of an approaching revolution. A certain not inconsiderable measure of support or consensus of opinion is in fact required by any state apparatus, and especially a democratic apparatus, if it is to function. If a bureaucratic elite successfully mobilizes the population for that bureaucratic elite's own aims and brings it into agreement with the leadership, this may be the sign of an extreme form of alienation. In the naive presentation of Sitnikov, the euphoric mood of the masses of the German population, for example, which were at times emotionally bound to Hitler, would have been an overcoming of political alienation. If finally Sitnikov draws attention to the 20 million workers who cooperate on the councils in the USSR, the question is bound to arise as to the extent to which these councils are a decisive political force. The original constitution of the councils after the October Revolution was, as is well known, very soon undermined by a factual dictatorship of the party and state bureaucracy and became a mere facade. There's a paper, I haven't read it but I kind of know like sort of like the ideas, but there's a paper that I should read by Simon Pirani. Uh, Simon Pirani being like a historian who wrote a book called The Revolution in Retreat, or The Russian Revolution in Retreat, which covers the period from like at the end of the Civil War to like 1924 or something like that. Um, I read it. I can't remember all the finer details, but one of the things one of the papers that he wrote is something like from participatory democracy to state mobilization, right? So what that means is that I think what the paper is kind of about is kind of like the depletion of substantial any remnants of like working class democracy in the USSR, accompanied by like mobilizations, like state parades and like shit like that. Um, and it was kind of like saying a similar thing to what is being said here about like the USSR. I mean, like saying what is said here about like um this reference to Hitler, how like a popularly supported government isn't a democratic government, necessarily a democratic government, and definitely not necessarily a workers' government. Um, what has to be looked at is like the substantial political content of both the production relations and the state, um, or the governing body, if the state's too loaded or specific a term to use. Um, so it's like, yeah, you could have a whole bunch, like, if everyone here, if everyone in the United States was like really, really into, really, really patriotic and really, really like attached to the status quo, uh, that would not make America a democratic or non-alienated society, right? Anyway, where am I at? The original constitution of the councils after the October Revolution was, as is well known, very soon undermined by a factual dictatorship of the party and state bureaucracy and became a mere facade. The Stalinist constitution of 1937, which still remains valid, then replaced the facade of the councils with a parliamentary facade with no significant change in the real conditions of power. Ideological alienation is also disputed by Sitnikov as a characteristic of Soviet society, even in the Stalinist period. In Sitnikov's eyes, my arguments appear to be as follows, quote, the anti-Marxists like to speak of the socialist ideology of Soviet society as an alienated, objectified philosophy which is designed to unite the individual sciences and Soviet society by pressure from above. Here the bourgeois ideologists see a relationship with Hegelianism. According to Fetscher, for the young Marx, philosophy was a concept of free, unalienated man, a philosophical humanism, and certainly not a theory on the objectives and means to achieve a new society. The theory of scientific communism is an alienated ideology, according to Fetscher, ... The absurdity of such assertions is obvious, as the great merit of Marxism surely consists in pointing out real ways to achieve human freedom and build a new society, unlike the utopian socialists, ... end quote, Sitnikov. Here again, misunderstanding goes hand in hand with unproven postulates. The, quote, Marxist ideology, end quote, which I have repeatedly criticized, shows no concrete way for overcoming alienation, but suggests to the population that real contradictions no longer exist. This is the case when Stalin speaks of the, quote, moral and political unity of the peoples of the Soviet Union, end quote, and the harmony between the classes and the social stratum of the intelligentsia, or even the new party program completely negates, or when the new party program completely negates the class character of Soviet society. The philosophy of dialectical materialism's many dogmatic theses on the eternity and indestructibility of matter and so forth, has equally little to do with, quote, scientific instruction for action, end quote. It is not my own observation which is absurd, but rather the transformation of a revolutionary theory into a doctrine which has the character of an apologia. Marxists such as Adam Schaff and Ernst Fischer, let's see who Ernst Fischer is. Sorry. I don't know if this is the same guy. Let's see. It seems like there's an Ernst Fischer here that's a writer. I want to see what books he wrote. I don't know. But I'm assuming this is the guy. Ernst Fischer lived from 1899 to 1972, also known under the pseudonyms Ernst Peter Fischer, Peter Wieden, Pierre Vidal, and Der Miesmacher. Was a Bohemian-born Austrian journalist, writer, and politician. I'm going to read his biography because it's, why the fuck not? Ernst Fischer was born in Komatau, Bohemia in 1899 as the son of the imperial and royal colonel and teacher of mathematics and descriptive geometry at military schools Josef Fischer and his wife Agnes. Ernst Fischer served on the Italian front in the First World War, studied philosophy in Graz, and did unskilled labor in a factory before working as a provincial journalist and then on the Arbeiter Zeitung from 1927. In 1932, Ernst Fischer married Ruth von Meyenberg. Initially a social democrat, Fischer became a member of the Communist Party of Austria, Kommunistische Partei Österreichs, or KPÖ, or KPÖ. I don't know how to fucking say that. Member in 1934, after being disillusioned in liberal democracy for not being able to withstand fascism. In 1934, after Ernst Fischer and his wife were involved in the Austrian Civil War, Ernst Fischer and his wife had to leave Austria. Ernst Fischer and his wife went to Czechoslovakia, where Ernst Fischer began working for the Comintern as an editor. In 1938, they went to Moscow, where Ernst Fischer continued to work for the Comintern. The Fischers lived at Hotel Lux, a luxury hotel that had been built in 1911 and was taken over by the Communist Party after the October Revolution. Following Adolf Hitler's seizure of power, the hotel became a refuge for communist exiles, especially Germans. The Fischers lived there from 1938 until 1945. When Fischer and his wife arrived at Hotel Lux, the Stalinist purges were still taking place, and the exiles living at the hotel were living in a climate of fear and terror. The autumn after their arrival, Ernst Fischer came home from work one evening looking terrified. Gussel Deutsch, an Austrian who had been arrested and had been in prison, had managed to smuggle him a note to alert him to the danger facing Fischer. Under torture, Deutsch had named Fischer as being involved in a plot against Stalin's life. Although the charges were completely false, by being accused, Fischer was in grave danger, and he immediately sought help from Georgy Dimitrov, one of the leaders of the Comintern. Dimitrov replied, quote, "I will be able to save you, but the others, ... end quote. After the war, Ernst Fischer remained an important figure in the KPO until 1969. Ernst Fischer served as Communist Minister of Information in the first post-war government of Renner. That's Karl Renner, right? I don't know. It just says Renner. I don't know if that's referring to Karl Renner. Karl Renner was an Austrian Marxist. Ernst Fischer published articles in Weg und Ziel, monthly journal of the KPO. Fischer and his wife were divorced in 1954. Ernst Fischer's first book, Memories and Reflections, was released when around the same time his ex-wife's book came out, Blue Blood and Red Flags: Revolutionary Female Life Between Vienna, Berlin, and Moscow. The two books covered the same period. Ernst Fischer is particularly famous in the West for his book The Necessity of Art, which I did see that when I was looked up Ernst Fischer. In this, Ernst Fischer took many of the commonplace concepts of Marxist artistic theory up to that point art is labor, collective versus individual, formalism, and socialist realism, and develops them in a wide-ranging essay on the history of art from magic and religion to the Romantics, critical realism, and art in the service of building socialism critically, not just state propaganda. The book has influenced many writers since the late 1950s, in particular Kenneth Tynan and John Berger. John Berger wrote a new introduction to the recent Verso Books edition. Ernst Fischer was expelled from the Communist Party in 1968 for being against the suppression of the Prague Spring. Being a former associate of the moderate wing of the Communist Party of Austria, Fischer gradually moved to the, quote, undogmatic Marxist, end quote, in Austria, and even renounced the concept of a dictatorship of the proletariat. Ernst Fischer continued to publish the monthly journal Wiener Tagebuch with Franz Marek, and played a role in the public sphere primarily as an undogmatic Marxist theorist. Ernst Fischer died on the 31st of July, 1972, in Deutsch Feistritze. So, that's who Ernst Fischer is, or Ernst Fischer. Thank you for letting me listening to that. I know it was a little long. It is my own observation which is absurd. This is back to the text. This is Iring Fetscher. It is my own observation which is absurd, but rather, it is not my own observation which is absurd, but rather the transformation of a revolutionary theory into a doctrine which has the character of an apologia. Marxists such as Adam Schaff and Ernst Fischer, who were both themselves at one time Stalinists, have since clearly recognized that, quote, the distortions of theory, end quote, can be eliminated only by a clear, conscious critique and return to Marx. By the systematic dismissal of the era of Stalin as the, quote, epoch of the personality cult, end quote, for which evidently only the personal vanity of the dictator and not the structure of society are made responsible, Sitnikov and Sitnikov's fellows blocked the path towards the reform of Marxist theory and Soviet society, which is an urgent necessity. They therefore ultimately do harm to themselves. In a final paragraph of his article, Sitnikov compares alienation, which he always mentioned only in quotation marks, a significant indication of his own distance from this concept. In capitalist and socialist societies, here again, Sitnikov falls back primarily on the future communist phase of the post-revolutionary society. Quote, first of all, socialism abolishes private property and hence the exploitation of the workers. This in itself is an important and decisive step on the road to complete abolition of all alienation. Secondly, because of the existing immaturity of socialism as the lowest stage of communism, certain elements of the alienation of man still remain to be overcome. Sorry, I forgot to say that this was a quote, I think. Give me a second. Here, Sitnikov falls back primarily on the future communist phase of the post-revolutionary society. Quote, first of all, socialism abolishes private property and hence the exploitation of workers. This in itself is an important and decisive step on the road to complete abolition of all alienation. Secondly, because of the existing immaturity of socialism of the lowest stage of communism, certain elements of the alienation of man still remain to be overcome. The level of production is still inadequate, a remnant of the old division of labor which prevents many people from exercising their chosen trade and forces them to be content with what for them is unpleasant labor, ... And if in addition to this hard, unskilled labor, the result may be that the value of work as such is not realized. There still exists a sector of workers under socialism who are not entirely satisfied with the work they are called upon to do, and do not know or see that work has become truly free, work for oneself. End quote, Sitnikov. Here again it must be recalled, this is Iring again, here again it must be recalled that the explanation of the cause of alienation is lying in private ownership of the means of production was initially only a hypothesis, albeit a well-founded one. The example of bureaucratic socialism in the Soviet Union, as well as the example of Oriental despotism, which Marx and Engels described, and to the risk of which Lenin drew attention, clearly show that not every form of non-private ownership can abolish alienation. This is a thing, as you know, you've followed my channel a bit, is that one of the things that I'm interested in, and this is actually relevant to this piece as well, is conceptions of the USSR. And since I've been focusing on the Trotskyist ones, because that's kind of like, for one, Trotsky's was one of the first like critiques of like Stalinism, right? So like, whatever you'll say about the seeds of Stalinism being in Lenin, there's definitely a different, like, the economy in 1925 was very much different than the economy in the Soviet Union in 1935. And so the analysis of it would have to take account those challenges, those changes which were instituted in the Stalin period, of the so-called revolution from above. And that's why I've been focusing on the Trotskyist ones. But another important aspect of it is there's a lot of people that use the concept of Oriental despotism, or the Oriental, or the Asiatic mode of production. And I think this was actually way more. This concept was developed way more by like the reference here is to Wittfogel, Karl Wittfogel, who I think might have become something of a conservative, but he was associated with the Frankfurt School. So I think this concept of like Oriental despotism and the Soviet Union. What was I gonna say? What was I gonna say? Fuck, I'm fucking blanking. Yeah, it was way. It seems like it was way more important in Germany than in other debates. Like, it's not really talked about in like the Trotskyist debates that I'm seeing, but there does seem to be some kind of like, there's some kind of notion that, especially within like the bureaucratic collectivism people, less so among those people who would later adopt like a state capitalist thesis, such as like James Danievska, Castoriadis, Cliff, and so on. But in the early bureaucratic collectivist people like Burnham and Schachtman and Joseph Carter and Hal Draper, um, the Jacobsons, and so on, they had this. What was really, I think, is most interesting for them is that like something being like, you can have an exploitative, alienated, non-emancipated society that is not on the basis of private property, uh, and uh, like you can have a non-socialist yet non-capitalist society, and that's precisely what they thought the Soviet Union was. But I know that like one of the things that they draw back to some extent, I've seen it in spots, but I don't know if it's over well elaborated, is like the fact that like, um, in certain societies, like I think it's like the Incas, maybe. I'm not an expert on the Incas, so I might be talking out my ass here, but the Incas, being like a non-capitalist form of like hierarchical exploitative society. And I think that's kind of like, sort of like, I don't think people who would talk about like something akin to Oriental despotism in the USSR would call the USSR like state capitalist. Um, so I think if I'm trying to build a richer understanding of how the USSR was understood in the 20th century by critical Marxists, I personally, this is just a note to self, I should check out more about Wittfogel. Interesting, I don't think there's anything on Wittfogel I don't think Wittfogel has a chapter in the Sage Handbook of Frankfurt School Critical Theory. It might have been worthwhile to have one. Anyway, where am I? Back to the text. The example of bureaucratic socialism in the Soviet Union, as well as the example of Oriental despotism which Marx and Engels described, and to the risks of which Lenin drew attention, clearly show that not every form of non-private ownership can abolish alienation. This is a point in the Soviet model which is sharply criticized by the Yugoslavs. Tito and his theoreticians demand a concretization of common ownership for the worker by cooperative self-administration of companies, which affects control of the workers over the management. The features which Sitnikov attributes to the higher phase of communist society must also appear extremely primitive to anyone who is well acquainted with the writings of Marx. In his critique of the Gotha program, Marx specifically stated, for example, that the aim could not be to make labor, quote, free, end quote, since it was already free in the capitalist market economy. Marx also never demanded that workers should realize, quote, the value of their labor, end quote. If Sitnikov, along the lines of the new Soviet Party program, describes an ascetic attitude to consumption and higher working morale as characteristics of Soviet citizenship in the era of full communism, this simply proves once again that the Soviet Union has developed, under the Soviet Union's bureaucratic organization, a substitute form of capitalism, which reproduces characteristic features of early capitalism up to its questions of morality. That is something that I feel like is not really discussed enough. Is like the correlation between a certain kind of like Bolshevik and especially like Stalinist kind of like, I don't know, puritanical morality in terms of like sexuality and responsibility and like militancy and like discipline and things like that. Those kind of ethos as they are reflected in like, what some people like Amadeo Bordiga call like revolutions with red flags, and how those same kind of ideals were kind of like the dominating virtues of early capitalist society, right? Self responsibility. And obviously, don't forget like that. Like I was thinking to myself just now, I was like, well, maybe they didn't have quite the collectivist thing, but definitely in like liberal ideology, they definitely don't view each out for themselves and fuck everybody else. They view it as like like I'm listening to one of the audiobooks I made of Simon Clark, and he's talking about like kind of like the moral philosophy of Adam Smith. And like one of the things that a lot of like the early like liberal commentators are very interested in is like this uh, combination um, with generalized commodity production being taken for granted and all of the social consequences that come from that being taken for granted. They're trying to strike a balance between like benevolence, I suppose, and self interest, right? And so this kind of like seeking one's self interest in the world of market affairs, uh, in commercial life, means not just being engaged in cutthroat competition with the others, but also accepting the rules of the game, right? Like, if you were in a capitalist society and say like everyone was to embrace a kind of like gangster's attitude, for instance, or something like that, where it's perfectly legitimate to seize another person's property if you can at least temporarily get away with it, would not allow that system to work, right? So there has to be this combination. There has to be this notion of the rights of commodity owners and a certain commitment to the principles and underlying that system, and to including like others' right to own property, in order for that society to even to be feasible. So I was going to say that there was a very highly individualist element that was absent in the Soviet Union, or like a highly collectivist element that was absent in the early days of capitalist development in the West. But there definitely is, right? There's definitely a commitment to the system, right? To established authority, to the state as the arbiter of equal rights before the law, which allow for the conditions of prosperity and the prosperity associated with capitalism to unfold, and for all individuals within society to benefit from that prosperity. Um, there's definitely a collectivist spirit within that is you know prevalent in um, in those early liberal like self narrations about what is happening in the society where capitalism is uh, um, the generalized commodity production is coming to obtain. Um, and I would say that there's certain individuality in you know in in early communism too, like the premises of like the kind of like unequal distribution, right? Or like accepting like one party. Sorry, what's the word? Like um all morality aside, of it saying like every um worker, especially in like the Stalin period, I'm thinking of, um, despite all the lip service paid to like self-sacrifice and Stakhanovism and things like that, Stakhanovism resulted in specialized pay for those involved, as well as other privileges, and is kind of coincided with the institution of like piecework, right, which is a highly individualistic form of wage labor, right, um, which causes which has the effect of disempowering the working class, right? Like, Marx calls piecework like one of the most pernicious forms of wage labor, and that was like very much instituted in the Soviet Union in the Stalin period. So, despite one the ostensible collectivism of the Soviet Union and the ostensible individualism of the liberal apologists, both of them have a combination of individualism and collectivism, which upholds alienated relations of production, or glosses over them, makes a mystificatory mask for them to wear. Uh, Maybe that's a little too verbose, but you get what I'm saying. So let me repeat the sentence I just said to get us back on track. If Sitnikov, along with the lines of the new Soviet Party program, describes an aesthetic attitude to consumption and higher work morale as characteristics of Soviet citizens in the era of full communism, this simply proves once again that the Soviet Union has developed under its bureaucratic organization a substitute form of capitalism which reproduces characteristic features of early capitalism up to its questions of morality. At the end of his study, Sitnikov passes on to a general assessment of my own and other critical works and states, quote, the bourgeois philosophers would only too gladly veil the, quote, alienation of men, end quote, to make it safe for the bourgeoisie. But life demands that they, too, should solve the problem. And so, like Fetscher, they seek a way out in objectivism. In reality, the statements of Fetscher conceal an apologia for bourgeois society, which would like to defend and maintain the capitalist front, end quote. Sitnikov. This accusation is based on the principle of the thief whom I mentioned earlier, who cries out, quote, stop thief, end quote. The psychoanalyst would say it is a typical case of projection. Whereas Sitnikov himself is in reality afraid of and rejects any critical application of the category of alienation to Soviet society, I have never denied the reality and extent of alienation in bourgeois society. It is not I, but Sitnikov and the other Soviet ideologists who attempt to conceal reality. What Sitnikov refers to as, quote, objectivism, end quote, is an attempt to analyze both societies critically and confront them with their own claims to achievements. If every indication of deficiencies and weakness in Soviet society is defined as an apologia for bourgeois society, responsible Soviet politicians would have no problem. They need not even listen to such criticism. The procedure is not a privilege of Soviet conservatives. There are also conservatives in the, quote, Western world, end quote, who like to dismiss vigorous critical intellectuals as secret allies of, quote, world communism, end quote, and so conveniently escape their arguments. Reactionaries of the world, you have no need to unite. Your cooperation is already exemplary. The end. Thanks for listening. I want to, but actually before I go, I want to go back to Sitnikov's biography again. Come on, where is he? Come on, where'd it go? God, now I have to find it again. You can go if you can just exit out of this if you don't feel like listening to this. But I was just basically trying to get to the point that after all this, after this grand story we've been listening to, um, I believe Sitnikov uh, basically adopts Fetscher's position. It's E.N. Sitnikov. What the hell? I don't know. Maybe I'm thinking of someone else. Maybe it's not Sitnikov who eventually adopted that standpoint. Oh, come on. I don't know. I think I might be thinking of someone else then that I looked up in the beginning because I cannot find Sitnikov. But yeah, that's the end. Sorry. Thanks for listening.